The Ultimate Guide to Postmodernism, Part 2. Now we get to the gold. Now we're answering the question of not just what postmodernism is, but more importantly, most importantly, where is postmodernism right and where is it wrong? We're going to look at every single way it's right and wrong. We're going to look at every limitation, abuse, and problem of postmodernism, and of course, by extension, modernism, because you can't understand one without understanding the other. What I find is rare in these discussions about postmodernism is you can find a lot of discussions, philosophical sorts, online about postmodern thinkers, and they can explain postmodernism to you, but in the end, after consuming all of that content, assuming it's not just a total straw manning of postmodernism, which is even more prevalent, assuming you're actually consuming some sort of like more academic, genuine considerations of postmodern philosophy, at the end of that, you're going to be left completely in the dark about what's really true in regards to postmodernism and reality. Like, where is it going right? Where is it going wrong? You're not going to know this. You could take years of college philosophy classes and you still won't know this because they're just going to like leave it up in the air. Like, well, this is what postmodern thinkers say and this is what modern thinkers say. And it's like, you make up your mind. But in reality, this is such complex and difficult and self-deceptive terrain that you're not going to be able to make up your mind. It takes years of contemplating this stuff, and it really takes transhuman levels of consciousness to be able to make sense of the limits of postmodernism, because postmodernists don't understand their own limits, and modernists don't understand their own limits, and they misunderstand the limits of postmodernism, although they also have some valid critiques. And we're going to be looking at all of that, ultimately working towards an integration, a synthesis of modernism and postmodernism, taking your mind beyond both. And this is the real value of this work here, is that this integration is extremely rare. Virtually nobody understands this kind of synthesis approach, this kind of big picture perspective. Nobody understands all the limits and all the problems. And the reason that they don't is because it's impossible to understand them through pure philosophy. You need to go beyond philosophy into spirituality and into awakening to really start to understand. And so speaking from that position, I can help you to sort out a lot of this confusion. So let's get started. There's also going to be a part 3 to this series, so stick with me till the very end. The good stuff comes towards the end. That's how I always structure my work. Okay, so how is postmodernism right? This is a long list, and then I'm going to give you a list of all the ways it's wrong. First and foremost, it's right in that it starts to understand the profoundly relativistic nature of reality. Relativity. Not just at the sort of Einsteinian level, but relativity in perspective. Looking at the world, making sense of reality is not just as simple as modernism assumed, which is just like, well, reality is a sort of a physical box in which we reside, and all we have to do is just like measure the box and measure the contents in the box, and then just give a sort of a catalog of all the stuff in the box and how it works, and we've got the physical laws, and then from there, basically everything else is just a sort of a more complex combination of physical laws at work, and so it's just a clockwork mechanism, and we can just describe it with equations, and what else is there to say? We understand reality. That's sort of the modernist approach, and really, as that approach has been tried for hundreds of years, we are starting to reach the end of that. And as we reach the natural end of that, we exhaust ourselves, but we are not very close to even understanding the nature of reality with science, with materialism. We've gotten some great progress. Don't get me wrong. We're not going to be throwing out all the lessons of science and materialism and modernism. There's good stuff there. There's some good physical laws. We understand how atoms work for the most part and so forth. That's all great. But when it comes to making sense of reality, that falls so short of our ultimate objective. That requires a relativistic way of looking at reality, especially when we're talking about not just like the very bottom layer of reality. If you think of reality as layers, atoms, molecules, cells, organisms, humans, civilizations, societies, so on. The really low-level stuff, modernism has a pretty good handle on the low-level stuff, like explaining the motions of atoms and molecules. But modernism really struggles in the higher domains, the more abstract domains, like explaining culture, morality, sociological phenomenon, spiritual phenomenon, religious phenomenon, all of the sort of messy, chaotic stuff that you cannot put into a simple equation and that cannot be reduced down to just motions of molecules. You can't reduce politics down to motions of molecules. Nor can you do that with human psychology and sexuality and many other things like that. Although, of course, it's all connected. So, generally speaking, almost every mind underestimates the significance of relativism, relativity. I have a whole episode called Understanding Relativism Part 1. Go look at that, because this is a very deep topic that we don't have nearly enough time to explain here. And I'm overdue on Part 2 of that series. I'm working on that as well. That's coming out. So I'm not going to go too deep into explaining relativism here. And frankly, one of the reasons I won't is because it's such a complex and subtle issue that my mind is not even in the mood right now to be discussing that. Like, in order to properly discuss relativism with you, I have to sit down for hours and think it through really deeply and even gear up my mind for it. Because it's not like I haven't done it before, but it's like I haven't done it in a while, so I have to gear up my mind to properly explain relativism to you and the profundity of it. It's hard to explain. But look, at a very basic level, for example, most human beings behave as though good is an objective thing. Good, like that's a good thing, that's a bad thing. Terrorism bad, Hitler bad, and then something else good. Jesus good. Without understanding that good is relative to the self. If you didn't have a self, if you didn't have an ego relative to which judgments were being made, there would be no such thing as good and bad. Do you understand that? See, a mind that doesn't understand this meta epistemic issue, and really it's more than epistemics, it's even metaphysical, a mind who can't understand what I just said about the nature of good. That's a mind of relatively low levels of development and understanding of reality. You can't understand reality unless you understand that good is relative. That's not something to argue. That's something for you to contemplate and have an insight into and actually understand. What is the nature of good and bad? And that's just the tip of the iceberg. And look, see, it's so tricky because pre-modern people don't understand this. But even modern people don't understand. The modern mind doesn't understand this because like a lot of these so-called like materialist scientists and atheists and rationalists, as I call them. So this whole category of people, skeptics, debunkers, and so forth, materialists basically, they pretend like they're strict rationalists and modernists. They are modernists. But what they get, like, for example, they still have a notion of good as something that's not relative. Even scientists believe in things like evil. Even scientists will have an idea of like, well, that's a bad thing, that's a good thing, and that's just not something subjective, that's something objective. Scientists, for example, believe in moral systems. They don't understand the relativity of morality. That's something you can also understand. Postmodernism helps us to understand these things by pointing out the relative nature of various kinds of perspectives, and also the fact that it's very easy to take on sort of a dominant perspective, which then monopolizes one's understanding of reality and serves as a sort of a pseudo-truth, dominating more minor perspectives. And relativism allows us to kind of break that apart and to see that these dominant perspectives, whether it's science, rationality, religion, that these are relative things, not absolutes. Another example of how modernism, for example, doesn't understand relativity is modernism doesn't understand that science is relative. Scientific knowledge is relative. That doesn't mean it's all false. That doesn't mean that anything goes. See, there's a lot of misconceptions about relativity, which is why you should watch that series, Understanding Relativism Part 1, where we discuss that, all those tricky problems. But here, just in summary, when I say science is relative, that doesn't mean that anything goes. It doesn't mean you can just bullshit your way through life and that you don't have to take science seriously and that there's no value to science. It doesn't mean that we now become conspiracy theorists and creationists and so forth. Something much more subtle is being said. Scientific knowledge is relative. Relative to what? Well, relative to human consciousness. It assumes that humans have similar levels of consciousness, assumes everyone has the same consciousness as you, relative to genetics, relative to certain perspectives and assumptions that you take up about the world. Relative. Science. Rationality is relative. This idea that rationality is the one true way of looking at the world, that's relative. Again, that doesn't mean that you should now become irrational. That doesn't mean that rationality doesn't have value, that you shouldn't use it. It has its purposes. But if you think that rationality is the one true way to look at reality, that's one of the problems of modernism. Where else postmodernism is correct is in pointing out the profoundly perspectival nature of reality. Don't think of reality as a clockwork machine. Think of it more as a collection of perspectives. It's a mental phenomenon. And as a mental phenomenon, it really matters what vantage point you're taking on a thing. To say something is true about reality requires having a certain vantage point. It assumes a certain vantage point. And if you take a different vantage point, then that thing is no longer true, or it changes color, it changes shape, so to speak. Postmodernism also is correct in pointing us in the direction of realizing that reality is irreducibly subjective. World and mind are entangled in a way that modernism didn't foresee. Modernism assumed that these are clean-cut categories. There's the world out there, there's the mind in here. And the mind is all the messy stuff, and the world is all the objective stuff. This duality itself is being questioned by postmodernism. Also, postmodernism is correct in that Western culture has a chauvinism problem. Ethnocentrism is another word for it. Of course, the Western world tends to look at the world through its own lens. When it looks at geopolitics, when it looks at different cultures, and it tends to privilege itself above others. This is a hot issue right now when it comes to, for example, the Western view of geopolitics and the Russian, Eurasian view of geopolitics, the Chinese view. There's this sort of battle going on right now across the world between transitioning from a unipolar world, which was the Western-dominated world order, to a more multipolar world, which allows different cultures, other cultures beyond Western culture, to have their own paradigms and points of view and their own geopolitical prerogatives, so to speak. And that not everything is destined to be Western culture. This idea that Western culture is just this sort of Fukuyamian idea that Western culture, the end of history, that Western culture is just going to take over the whole world and that it's just going to be that simple. Well, our politics is showing that it's not that simple. And ethnocentrism is a serious problem. No matter what culture you're in, you're looking at the world through that culture, and that culture is imparting various biases that you're not recognizing. And this is part of the sort of the liberal, neoliberal, neocon establishment in the West, in American culture, in American politics, for example. But there's many other ways that it manifests. This idea that Western culture is the best, the truest, the strongest, because it's led to the domination by America, through military power, through empire, these sorts of things, and that this is somehow a validation of the truthfulness and validity of Western culture. This idea, which is popular on the right, this is not good. This is not good sense making of the world. There's deep problems with that, and postmodernism calls that out. And of course, conservatives and right wingers don't like that, and in general, even liberals don't like that, because this relativism, it can go very far. It gets you to really question the paradigm you've been looking at the world from. And that's correct. That's what this work is really about. When your mind becomes more sophisticated, more developed, and your sense making goes further than the center of gravity of our society and culture, then all these things start to be questioned. And it's not easy to question this stuff, because the mind doesn't want to change. The mind is not very open. Postmodernism points us to the truth that no religion or culture is the best or truest. So postmodernism is right in that regard. Modernism tends to assume that one culture is the best. Western culture or whatever that may be. And you see this. You see this Indian, for example, Indian nationalists believe that Hindu culture is the best culture. And, Pakistani nationalists believe that Muslim culture is the best culture. And, Iranian nationalists believe that, and theocrats, they believe that their culture is the best culture. And Russian nationalists believe that as well. And then American nationalists believe that it's American culture, right? So who's right? Well, maybe none of them are right. Maybe all of them are missing something deeper, which is the relativity of all of these kinds of perspectives and worldviews. Postmodernism is correct in that many things we regard as real, objective, natural are actually relative social constructs and could be changed or reinvented. So, for example, all of religion, all of culture, morality, much of morality, these are socially constructed systems invented by humans, filled with human bias. They change over time. They change across culture. They're different even within the same culture. They're subcultures. So you don't even have a single monolithic Hindu culture, because there's all various factions of Hinduism and so on. And so it is in America. There's no such thing as American culture. This is a fiction. There's a smorgasbord, a hodgepodge, a melting pot of various subcultures that comprise this fiction called American culture. And then we have all these battles and wars about who gets to define what the right culture is. This leads to all sorts of social, political problems, religious problems, moral problems. So a lot more of the things that people take as true and objective are actually social constructs that could be changed and reinvented if we wanted to. A lot more than modernism or pre-modernism assumes. And in this respect, postmodernism is correct. That is true. That a lot of these things can be reinvented, rethought, and in fact, not only could they be, but they must be as we evolve, as our technology evolves. We need to change our religion, our culture, our morality to deal with the new technological situation that we're dealing with. And not just technology, but also technology enables then the development of the human psyche. That leads to higher stages of development for mankind. And then that also requires us, necessitates even, us to rethink how we conceive of religion, how we conceive of culture, how we conceive of geopolitics, whether we should have a multipolar world versus a unipolar world, and how we conceive of morality, because there's different stages of morality as well. There's not a single morality. And a lot of this stuff is missed by modernism. And then what happens is that you get stuck in a single religion, in a single culture, in a single geopolitical framework or paradigm, in a single moral system, in a single stage of development. And then your mind is just so straitjacketed that you're actually incapable of making sense of reality at a broader level. You're not able to make sense of all the different cultures and peoples and religions that are out there, and how all that connects with science, for example, and rationality and spirituality that's beyond the rational. Postmodernism is also correct in its construct awareness, this emphasis on construct awareness. Construct awareness is such a profound topic. I'm going to have a whole episode on that. It's so fundamental. Construct awareness is so fundamental to higher levels of intelligence and understanding of reality that, in a sense, we can boil down cognitive development to just higher stages of construct awareness, more and more construct awareness. What is construct awareness in a nutshell? It's that you notice that many of the things that you take as just true and given as real are really constructions of the human mind, both individually and collectively. So, for example, the majority of mankind is not developed enough cognitively to understand that their religion, whether it's Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, that this is a construct. This is a mental construct, a human, relative, biased, selfish, oftentimes fantastical mental construct. That would be very valuable to understand. Now, the modern mind tends to understand some degree of that, but it doesn't understand, for example, that science is also a social construct. And even rationalism is a construct. The idea that reality is rational, that's a construct of the human mind. This is such a deep topic that, it bears its own episodes, but this just gives you a little taste. The difference between modernism and postmodernism is that postmodernism understands the subtleties of construct awareness more than modernism. But just because it understands that does not mean that it's maxed out its construct awareness. There's much higher levels of construct awareness beyond postmodernism. So be careful with that. Many of the things that postmodernism identifies as legitimate problems and truths, it even itself doesn't understand how deep the problem goes, how true it really is. Because postmodernism ends up getting in its way. We'll get to that in the second half of this episode, where I give you all the problems with it. Postmodernism is correct in pointing out that human knowledge is insanely biased. Not just the conclusions that we come to, but even the methods themselves are biased. So I'm not just saying that, for example, if you're a psychologist or a sociologist or a political scientist doing research, that is, and then you do that research and you get some biased conclusion. Obviously that happens. And human bias gets introduced into the method, into the ways that that this research is conducted. Obviously, that happens. No, I'm saying something even deeper, that even the methods, the very method of academia, for the institution of academia, and all of the methods that come with academic research of any field, I'm saying that itself is insanely biased. And I'm saying that even science, even the way physicists do physics, that's insanely biased. And our entire understanding of the universe is very much biased by just the fact that we're humans. So postmodernism starts to catch on to that a little bit. Not all the way, but a little bit. Postmodernism is especially good at sort of pointing out that one culture is one culture's view of the world is equally valid as another culture's view of the world. So in this sense, postmodernism sort of kind of like understands this by looking at different cultures in the world and not privileging one over the other, which is important. If you're doing scientific research, like sociological, I'm not talking about physics, but I'm talking about like sociological research, or, you know, more abstract stuff like that, psychological research, political research, economics and so on. If you're doing this kind of research, like, you can't just privilege Western culture and do this research with the assumptions of Western culture and then apply that to the entire world. That's not, obviously that's improper science. You see how that ruins your science? Because why would Western culture, why would that be the best and only way of looking at the world, scientifically speaking? It isn't, right? So you can't privilege one culture. If you're going to do science well, you can't privilege one culture's view of reality over another. So postmodernism understands this, but then postmodernism still doesn't really understand the deeper levels of bias, which is just the human species as a whole has its own bias in looking at the world, which even postmodernists are guilty of. Postmodernism is correct in that science, rationalism, and mainstream values are biased and they can be oppressive while claiming to be objective. So anytime someone claims that some way that they're looking at the world or their method of sense-making is objective, this postmodernism casts doubt on this. And that's correct. You should be very skeptical about any such claims. Science and rationality are often weaponized. They're weaponized by the ego mind for various sorts of survival purposes. They're weaponized by business people to earn more money. Weaponized by religious people to promote their own favorite religion. Weaponized by politicians to promote their, economic policy, which helps them and their friends get richer or get more power. Or helps one ethnic group dominate another ethnic group, like in Israel-Palestine. There's this modernist, if you subscribe to sort of modernism, you might look at the Israel-Palestine situation, you might not see the relativity of it, and you might say, well, Israel is more developed and Palestine is less developed. Palestine, has a bunch of barbaric terrorists and so forth. And so just Israel deserves to just dominate that region. This sort of comes with modernism. And then you will rationalize that and say, you will combine that with science and rationality, and you will, and with your moral system, and you will say that is, that's just the proper way to look at that situation. You will combine it with your economic worldview. And you're not going to see the Palestinian side. Or you might not see the Russian side. When you look at the Russian-Ukraine situation, you might not be able to see the Russian side. Now, that doesn't mean that people who are pro-Russian are postmodernists or have a very deep understanding of relativity. No, usually people who are pro-Russian from the American side, they have their own, twisted ideologies and problems. So be careful about that. Just because someone is pro-Palestinian or pro-Russian or whatever, pro-Chinese, it doesn't mean that they understand any of this stuff that I'm talking about. Usually they're doing it as a reaction against actually, stage green, for example. That's how conservatives, that's what conservative supporters of Russia and so forth are doing. They're not postmodernists by any stretch of the imagination. The next thing that postmodernism is correct about is that science is one epistemology out of many. This is perhaps one of the biggest things that modernism doesn't understand. Modernism just cannot understand how science can be one epistemology out of many. It's like, Leo, well, what are the other epistemologies? What's better than science? It just does not compute for the modernist mind. And then the modernists will go and they will create sort of a straw man version of postmodernism, and they will say, well, these postmodernists are so soft-minded, so soft-headed, and so delusional that they think that they have found something better than science. And then you find examples where postmodernists say some silly things and they try to sort of like challenge science. They're not very effective at it many times. And then the modernist thinks, well, look, I've debunked the postmodernists. No, you haven't even begun to consider seriously what it means to say that science is just one epistemology, a relative epistemology, one out of potentially many, and not the best. And the same thing when it comes to rationality and rationalism. Postmodernism accurately points out that rationality itself is a bias, and rationalism has serious blind spots and is insufficient to make sense of reality. Which is true. You can't make sense of reality through strict rationalism. And to the modernist mind, this just doesn't compute, because the modernist mind doesn't understand what else there could be but rationalism. It's like you've got rationalism or you've got irrationality and superstition and conspiracy theories. These are the only two options. So of course, rationalism is the best. Well, this would require a whole many hours long discussion on the nature of rationalism and all of its limits, which is coming. I will have that for you. That will be very powerful. You'd have to deconstruct rationalism. How do you do that? Well, it's very difficult. And you see, as a modernist, you have this very sneaky trick that your mind can do is your mind can always just fall into the what's called the pre-trans fallacy, which is that anything I'm saying here, any criticism or limitation of modernism that's pointed out to you, you can always just say, well, but then that's going to take us back to pre-modernism, to old school religion and conspiracy theories and superstitions and delusions. See, this kind of move, your mind can make that kind of move. That's the pre-trans fallacy, and then you don't understand that there's something higher that's being pointed to here. Obviously, I'm not talking about going back to fundamentalist religion or something like that. Nor are the postmodernists. Postmodernism is correct in that reality is way more complex, chaotic, ambiguous, abstract, and illusory than rationalism ever assumed. Postmodernism is correct in that you should be very skeptical of absolute truth claims, of these theories of everything that modernists like to come up with, or pre-modernists, in the case of Christians and Muslims and so on, and oversimplified grand narratives. People get stuck in meta-narratives a lot. This is a huge problem. Postmodernism is correct in that there isn't an objective truth at the level of worldview or paradigm. So here is a very critical insight. This is a life-changing insight right here. Look, postmodernism can be applied to the level of individual factual propositions, such as I can say, the sky is blue. Is that true or is that false? And then you can sort of apply a modernist lens to that, and you could say, well, yeah, the sky is objectively true for everybody. That's just objectively scientifically true. Sky is blue. And to even claim anything otherwise is absurd and irrational. For the postmodernist, this is sort of a challenge because it's difficult for a postmodernist to sort of argue the point that the sky is not blue, even though that's what the postmodernist wants to do. But really that's because postmodernism is not meant to be applied at the level of individual factual propositions, like snow is white, the sky is blue, water is made of hydrogen and oxygen molecules and atoms. This is not what postmodernism is meant to deal with. Postmodernism is meant to deal with higher level abstractions. And one of the problems with modernism is that modernism wants to reduce all higher order abstractions and sciences and sense-making schemes down to just physics and mathematics and equations. And of course, this is the thing that postmodernism realizes you can't do. But modernism doesn't realize yet why you can't do that. So the postmodernist, the truths of postmodernism, the profundity and wisdom of postmodernism really applies when it's applied not to individual factual physical propositions, but to more higher level abstractions. And that's actually where most of us live. Most of us do not live in a world of simple factual propositions. That's not how you make sense of reality, even if you're a scientist. Even if you're a physicist, that's not mostly how you make sense of reality. That's not how you make sense of politics. That's not how you deal with other human beings. That's not how psychology works. Most truth claims are not dry, isolated empirical facts about the world, but part of a larger system or point of view. This is what we call the worldview. So it's much easier to have a notion of objective truth when it comes down to physical atomic facts, like snow is white, sky is blue, so on. But that notion breaks down very quickly when it comes to looking at things at a higher level of abstraction in the social sciences, less in the STEM, but in the more of the social sciences, and more in terms of like actually how human beings relate to each other and understand the world together. This is modernism makes the mistake of overemphasizing the importance of these empirical facts. But what is the empirical fact of the Israel-Palestine situation? The empirical facts there are hardly relevant. That's not what that conflict is about. It's not a conflict about empirical facts. The Russia-Ukraine situation, that's not a conflict about empirical facts. The political situation in the United States with Trumpism and neoliberalism and progressivism, these are not really conflicts of empirical facts. And most importantly, the way that your mind, the ego mind, makes sense of reality, it doesn't care about empirical facts. It's doing something much more sophisticated than just looking for empirical facts. Sense-making is way more than individual, empirical, objective, factual claims. There is a larger point of view that is being constructed by the mind, which is shaping how all empirical facts that are coming in are interpreted, made sense of, given meaning to, given value to, and then affect your survival in your life. That's what's really being missed by modernism. Modernism acts as though it can just be purely objective and scientific and kind of stand back and just look at the facts, and the facts will themselves tell you how they should be interpreted and what they mean and what their value is. And then from that, we can all just kind of agree and come to a consensus and build a nice, healthy society. But as we see more and more in our political situation, this is not how it actually plays out. And modernism struggles to really explain why that is. You could say, well, the majority of people are just uneducated, ignorant, and deluded. But it's more complicated than that. It's not just that. It's that people have different worldviews, shaped by their survival needs, by their egos. And that's not just true of dumb hicks in Alabama in the flyover states. That's true of academics. That's true of scientists. That's true of physicists. They have their own worldviews and biases. And in fact, the way that science really works is that you have your point of view, your worldview, and then through that you are doing your science. Science has infected your whole sense-making apparatus, and then when you have some sort of empirical facts or whatever, they are being twisted and fit and molded into your larger worldview. If you're an atheist, a materialist, and so forth, that's how you're interpreting various kinds of empirical facts, whereas a theist will interpret them differently. This is not really appreciated deeply enough by modernist science, by the STEM fields, because largely it's irrelevant to them, but it can only be irrelevant in the short term. In the long term, it's all going to be relevant because it's a failure at sense-making. So one of the top mistakes of modernism is this delusional posturing that one's worldview is somehow objective. There's nothing objective about your worldview. Now, if you want to argue that snow is white is an objective claim, you can make a pretty solid argument. It would be hard for me to argue against that. If you want to claim that the sky is blue as it is an objective scientific empirical fact that cannot be questioned, it's going to be hard for me to argue against that. But That's not really what postmodernism is arguing against. Postmodernism is arguing about more sophisticated, more complex, more abstract claims about the world than just those kinds of atomic facts. And human knowledge is not just a collection of objective data. It's there's a deep psychological and sociological component to it, and there's even a metaphysical, spiritual component to it, because your mind ultimately is constructing reality, and it's not doing that in a neutral way. It's doing that in a self-serving way so that the mind gets to survive. And this is what scientists are not understanding. This way that even when you're doing science, you're not above this game, this survival game of the mind. And there's a serious danger of rationalizing and reifying your interpretations of reality as facts. When they are not facts, they're interpretations. Most of what humans call facts are interpretations. I explained that in my episode about interpretation. Go search for that. Powerful, powerful stuff. So that's the key to really making sense of postmodernism, is make sure that you're applying it to the right domain of sense making. Because it's easy to strawman postmodernism by saying that, well, the sky is blue, snow is white, postmodernism is stupid. That would be to miss the point. In some profound sense, human beings live in different realities from each other. And the reason that is because human beings have different consciousnesses. And reality is a consciousness. And we don't all share the same consciousness. This is something that postmodernism gets right, because modernism assumes that we all just have the same consciousness. And if somebody doesn't have the same consciousness, they're just insane. To make sense of insanity and mental illness, it's a lot more tricky than just calling somebody insane and wrong. Something is wrong with their brain. No, they have a different consciousness than you. You could say, well, yeah, but they're having hallucinations and so forth. Yeah, but what is a hallucination? How do you know that what you call reality isn't also a hallucination? See? Postmodernism starts to catch on to some of that. The relativity of consciousness, which modernism misses. Postmodernism is also correct, fundamentally, in recognizing that all values are relative. Like, what do you value in life? That's relative. The value you put on things is relative. Modernism tends to miss this. Even values such as truth, objectivity, rationality, scientific rigor, these are technically relative. This is not understood by most people, by most modernists. Truth is a relative value. That doesn't mean that all truth is relative per se. It just means that you caring about truth. There's nothing in the universe that forces you to care about truth, or objectivity, or rationality. These are human constructions in terms of their value, right? A human had to come along and say truth is valuable. Objectivity is valuable. Rationality is valuable. Scientific rigor is valuable. The truth is that if you look around the world, most human beings do not actually hold scientific rigor and rationality as valuable. And they're irrational. Half the world is irrational simply because they don't even value rationality, epistemic rigor, and so on. Technically speaking, these are relative values. Now, if you're in academia, you're in science, you're so immersed in the culture of truth and objectivity and rationality and scientific epistemic rigor and so forth, that to you, you're like a fish in water there, so you assume that these are just values that are objective, that everybody should hold. No, that's just part of your brainwashing in academia and part of materialist science. For example, suffering, the human race going extinct, violence, genocide, and lying and deception. Usually a modernist would say these are bad things, right? These are bad. Objectively bad. No, they're not objectively bad. There's nothing objectively bad about suffering or the human race going extinct or nuclear war or genocide. There's nothing bad about these things. The badness of it is a relative human construction. We attribute value to these phenomena in consciousness. It's not scientific to say that these things are bad. It's actually unscientific. The problem with science here is that it's actually failing at its own game. It's not being rigorous enough. If you're a rigorous scientist, you have to reject the idea that suffering is bad, or that the extinction of the human race is bad, or that genocide is bad. If you claim that these things are objectively bad, you're not understanding the relativity of consciousness. And you're not actually being scientific, and you're not being rational. This is a very flimsy, shallow, poorly thought out form of rationality. And even if objective values existed, the same value can be actualized in endless different ways. So a lot of people value truth, but that doesn't mean that that their notion of what is true is ever going to be the same. Postmodernism is correct in pointing out some of these things. This is the value of it. There are many valid value systems, lifestyles, cultures, and worldviews, far more than modernism assumes, than most people assume. There are many valid ways of interpreting, experiencing, and thinking about the world. Many valid ways to be, not just as a man or a woman, but maybe something in between. Not just as straight and heterosexual, but something queer. Not just as Western neoliberalism, but as something else. Humans limit themselves. Modernists limit themselves by constructing these narrow boxes, categories, dualities within which to fit reality. And then they think in terms of these boxes, and they reify over time. These boxes get reified, and then they become one sense of reality. And this skews our ability to make sense of everything. Postmodernism catches on to this fact, whereas modernism and pre-modernism does not. That's its value. That's its core value. For example, a lot of people are under the impression that Judeo-Christian Western values are the best. You have to realize that that is a construction. That's a construction. That's a self-biased construction of the Western worldview. Of course it views itself as the best. Of course. That's easy. What's hard is to understand how it's not the best. That's what's hard. If you grew up in this paradigm. What else postmodernism gets correct is the importance of multipolarity. The idea that one country, one empire should dominate the global order. Why? In what way is this truthful? In what way is this aligned with truth and fairness and equality? It's not. Realistically, America should only have as much power as the percentage of people that it has in its borders. That should be the extent of American influence in the world. It shouldn't be like America dominates 50% of the globe, even though it has not even a tenth of the global population. Why? There are many countries, smaller countries, that are getting dominated and squished and marginalized. Their viewpoint is not being fairly considered. That's going to have to change in the future. This idea that America just gets to dominate the whole globe with its culture, this is not going to stand. It's not in alignment with truth, with fairness, with consciousness. And we're seeing that falling apart. And as that falls apart, what do you think is going to happen to American politics? Do you think Americans are going to be happy about that? Or are they going to react in all sorts of dysfunctional ways against the loss of their power? See? It's important to see these larger trends. You know, it's interesting because Americans who vote for Trump, for example, they like to complain about outsourcing of jobs and how unfair it is that Americans are losing their standard of living and so forth. But this is such a narrow, ethnocentric, such an American-centric, such a self-biased way to look at what's really going on in the globe. What's really going on is that over the last 2 to 100 years, America has been disproportionately benefiting and leeching off the resources and value that it was getting from the third world. And so Americans had an elevated and artificially elevated standard of living relative to the rest of the world because we were benefiting from their oil, their natural resources, their labor, their sweatshops, and so on. And we've gotten accustomed and comfortable there. But the reality is that we've been unfairly treating the rest of the world. We've been marginalizing their culture, their religions, their traditions, and also exploiting their resources and so forth. And we've gotten so fat and rich and powerful off of that, that now, when things are starting to equalize, now that those nations are rising up and they're developing themselves and they're starting to reach parity with America, you know, China, India, Russia, the Middle East, they're all starting to reach parity. Still not there, but making good progress. As that's happening, what do you think is going to happen to that fat, rich position that America developed? Of course it's going to dissipate. It has to dissipate. Americans have to lose some of their privileges. That's not a mistake. That's not something wrong. That's in alignment with justice, equality, fairness, and truth. Because if you think life is difficult in the Rust Belt states in America, in rural America, life is bad. Well, how about rural China? How about rural India? It's like, oh, well, we don't care about them. We only care about America. America first, right? But you see, this is the problem, though. That's a very limited way of thinking about the world. It lacks empathy. It lacks truthfulness. It lacks a curiosity about other perspectives. It's fundamentally disrespectful to the perspectives of others around the world. Do you see that when you say America first? Look, you can take that position, but if you take that position, just realize that's a low position you're taking in terms of the possibility of levels of development and worldviews that you could have. You're choosing a low one. That's your choice. There's consequences to choosing a low worldview. You're gonna be, a lot of downstream consequences that are hard to enumerate because they're subtle and they take place over decades, so you don't see them. But they will happen to you. Postmodernism is right in that relativism, multiculturalism, equality, fairness are important goals and values. Although, of course, themselves, those values are biased and relative. Postmodernism is correct in that knowledge is highly contextual, shaped by cultural, historical, and social contexts. There is no such thing as a fact without a context. That's what relativity leads us to understand. Postmodernism is correct in that power structures influence what is considered knowledge and truth. You should be extremely skeptical if anybody ever tells you that they have just a neutral notion of knowledge and truth and that they're just neutral actors. They're not neutral actors. They're so biased they don't even understand that their own rationalizations of neutrality are the very bias that is at play. Knowledge and truth, what humans like to call truth, these are usually used to serve some kind of power structure and some sort of survival game that's really being played, even within science. within academia, certainly within religion. Religion is all about power. It's all about survival. It's not about neutral truth. Postmodernism is correct in that we need to place more importance on considering marginalized perspectives. To develop our minds, we can't be stuck in any one perspective. And we can't just ignore perspectives or demonize them. We need to take the marginalized ones seriously. We can't just be looking at the world through the dominant perspective of our culture and our era. Like right now, we're living through this technological internet age, and we might say that the dominant perspective is materialist science and technocrat neoliberalism. We can't just look at the world through that lens and make sense of it. That's not going to work fundamentally. That's what postmodernism alerts us to. There's value in the things that are being marginalized, the perspectives that are being marginalized. Postmodernism is also correct in that language matters. Language is not a neutral thing. Language shapes our perception and our construction of reality. It's a big deal. Postmodernism is also correct in that human identity is not fixed but fluid, subjective, multifaceted, and largely constructed. Categories like man or woman, individual, collective, these are not merely objective givens. We make sense of the world through categories, and we construct these categories to suit ourselves, and then we imbue these categories with meaning and value. And these categories are not neutral. These categories are designed by our minds to skew things in our own favor. So if you're a man, you look at the world in terms of men and women, and then you, of course, this isn't always the case, but a lot of young men will look at the world in terms of men and women, and then they will marginalize women and elevate men in their view of things. You can look at the world in terms of individuals and collectives, and then you can marginalize. You could say, well, the collective is bad, the individual is what's good. Jordan Peterson does this. It's actually very ironic because, Christianity is all about the collective Christian community. And yet he's really big on individualism. He demonizes and marginalizes the collective. Why? Because he's reacting against socialism and communism. So you see, you have to be extremely careful, because if you're going to be just a sloppy with these categories, you're going to delude yourself, you're going to delude others around you, and then you're going to get the kind of politics and ridiculousness that we have going on in our society today. Gender is not a given. Gender is not just something that comes baked with biology. Even sex is not a given. You might say, well, sex is just a biological fact. Is it? Is it a biological fact? First of all, what is a biological fact? What is a fact? How do you distinguish a fact from a non-fact? Who gets to say? And then in terms of sex, this is so tricky. Because on the one hand, it's kind of silly to say that, well, sex is subjective. Sex is constructed. As though I'm saying that, like, having a sex organ is a construct. It's not a construct in a certain sense, but in another sense, it is a construct. Because the fact that you're focusing on the sex organ, the fact that you're categorizing people and objects by sex organs, that's a bias. That's a construction. That doesn't mean that when you see a cat walking down the street, that its sex organ changes based on how you're thinking about it. That's not what's being said. But what's being said is that the fact that you're categorizing cats based on their sex organs and so forth, and you're thinking about animals just in terms of two boxes that they could fit in, male, female, eventually that's going to crumble and collapse, right? That's not a sustainable way of making sense of reality, because you're going to discover organisms that don't have just two boxes. They have three or four or more, or you have ambiguity between these boxes, and it's more like a spectrum. And then you have all sorts of weird organisms out there, like fungi and bacteria and plants and so forth that don't fit into these categories that you assume are just given and baked into biology. They're not baked into biology. These are things that humans are doing. And postmodernism is correct in pointing some of this out. Now, does it go too far? Can this be abused? Absolutely, it can be abused. In the end, postmodernism is correct in that all of your distinctions will ultimately collapse. See my series called Understanding Duality, Part 1, 2, 3, where we discuss all the distinctions, dualities that humans tend to construct reality with and understand reality through. Postmodernism is also correct in that all meaning is invented. Nihilism must be faced because ultimately life is meaningless. Even scientific people, rational people, they still don't understand the significance of this truth, that all meaning is invented. Even the meaning of your science, of your scientific discoveries, the meaning of rationalism and the meaning you attach to debunking deluded people and conspiracy theory, the meaning you attach there, that's a construction. That needs to be faced. All of the religious meaning, that's a construction. So there you go. Those are some of the truths of postmodernism. Now, it's kind of ironic because postmodernism wants to deny the notion of truth per se, but and yet postmodernism contains many important truths about reality. How can that be? Is that a contradiction? Well, there's a way to make sense of that, and we will really in part 3. There's a performative contradiction to postmodernism, which I will help to resolve in part 3. But for now, just I would say that postmodernism definitely contains important truths within it. And one of those important truths is that truth is not a simple monolithic objective thing, but it's a fragmentary, perspectival, subjective, relativistic sort of thing. And maybe a better way to look at it is not as a monolithic absolute truth, but a collection of micro-truths, micro-narratives. Okay, here are the top problems for modernists. Modernists act like relativity is a joke. They don't understand its significance. But actually, relativity is so deep that even postmodernists don't fully appreciate, understand, or explain it properly. Another thing that modernists get wrong is that modernists will get stuck in a frame that he thinks is universally or objectively true, but it actually is not. And therefore, it misses unorthodox perspectives, limiting the mind's requisite variety. The modernist will get trapped in grand narratives, confusing them for reality, reifying his constructions. This leads to paradigm lock and seriously limits and biases our ability to do advanced sense-making and makes understanding of ultimate consciousness impossible. Any grand narrative you construct will be limited, biased, and unsuitable for all the vast diversity of people and organisms that exist in the universe. Modernism creates this false sense of epistemic completeness. And furthermore, every grand narrative must necessarily splinter because of the relativistic nature, the perspectival nature of reality and consciousness. So even people who subscribe to some sort of monolithic meta-narrative are going to disagree, fight, and diverge with each other. And these meta-narratives will splinter. So for example, within Christianity, it's hard to find two Christians who believe exactly the same thing about Christianity. You have all these splintered groups. You have the Protestants, you have the Catholics, you have the Eastern Orthodox Christians, but then within those you have further splinter groups. So what is the correct meta-narrative? You can't even say that it's Christianity. A pre-modernist would want to say Christianity is the correct meta-narrative for understanding reality. But even that doesn't make sense if you look at it closely under a microscope, because what you see is that there's not a Christian grand meta-narrative. There are multiple different Christian meta-narratives that all disagree with each other. And then you have the same thing with Islam. You might, looking at it from in a sort of sloppy, loose way, you could say, well, if you believe in Islam, then Islam is the grand meta-narrative for making sense of reality, right? But no, because you have the Shias and you have the Sunnis, and then even within that you have the Sufis, and you have further subdivisions, and they don't agree with each other, they kill each other over those differences. And you might say, well, that's just religion. No, it's not just religion. You have the same thing. Take neoliberalism, take capitalism, take socialism, take libertarianism. You're going to have different splinter groups within all of those who disagree with each other. And then take science, take physics, take the hardest of physics, take quantum mechanics, take string theorists, take cosmology. They're going to disagree with each other. Einstein and Bohr did not agree with each other. Einstein disagreed with the sort of the random nature of subatomic particles and quantum mechanics. So scientists don't agree. This notion that there's a single thing called science, that itself is a pure fucking fiction. There is no such thing as a single science. You have different versions of science, both now, but also across time too. Don't forget across time and across cultures too. Modernism and pre-modernism do not have any serious way of dealing with this problem. The way they deal with this problem is they limit their mind to one of these splinter groups, one of these paradigms, and then they live as though that paradigm is the one true one. They don't recognize that something much more sophisticated is going on, which is causing all of this splintering. What you have to ask yourself is, why is there all this splintering? It's almost like a rule of the universe that any worldview, no matter what it is going to splinter. You can create a cult in the middle of a jungle that believes in some sort of orthodox, crazy ideas and let it run for a few decades, and I promise you that it's going to splinter, and that cult will divide in two, and that cult will have two cults rather than one that believe different things. They disagree with each other, they badmouth each other, they hate each other, they fight each other, they kill each other. Why does that happen? I suggest that happens for very profound epistemic and metaphysical reasons that modernism and pre-modernism do not understand, but postmodernism is starting to understand. Because the nature of consciousness is relativistic. That's why this happens. And because human sense-making is deeply biased by constructions that we are making to suit ourselves, our mind is constructing reality, and everybody is constructing reality in their own personal way in order to suit their own survival, the survival of their ego mind. And this level of construct awareness, this is construct awareness I'm talking about now, this is over the heads of everybody. Nobody sees how profound this is, how pervasive this is, how deep this goes, how wide this goes. Because people are getting stuck in a single meta-narrative. So modernism and pre-modernism create a sort of a false unity, an illusion of unity that doesn't really exist, like the illusion of science. The science. There is no the science. That's an illusion. The illusion of unity of science. Why is this happening? Because these are human inventions. The reason all these worldviews ultimately splinter and fall apart is because They're human inventions. And these human inventions are not arbitrary. They were invented at a particular place in space and time to suit somebody's survival needs, individually and collectively. They serve a survival need of an individual and a collective that the individual is a part of, a tribe, a group. So if you have a group of people living in the jungle, they need to construct their own worldview and sense-making system of that particular jungle at that particular point in time, which is going to help them to survive in that jungle. They will do those constructions. But over time, the jungle changes, the time changes, the technology changes, new people come, old people leave, situations change, and development levels change also, psyches change, and then those human inventions, sense-making systems, they no longer work. They're no longer as effective as they used to be. They need to be changed. And therefore they splinter. And of course, another reason why they splinter is because you have different people with different survival needs. Women have different survival needs than men. Trans people have different survival needs than both men and women. Rural people have different survival needs than urban dwellers. People who use certain technologies have different survival needs than people who don't use those technologies, right? And so because of this, everything is always in motion and it's fluid. And so splintering happens because survival is so infinitely diverse. It's the same splintering fundamentally that is happening when you have speciation. You know, you learned about Darwin's finches in the Galapagos or wherever they are, the speciation that goes on small islands of different species. That's fundamentally what's happening, but in the human psyche, individually and collectively. See, that's very profound to understand that. But modernism will deny that, because modernism wants to claim that science and rationality are not that way. Because if they are that way, that undermines their objectivity. Yeah, it does. It does. But maybe that's not a mistake. Maybe that's a feature. Modernism has a problem in that it can't contain and deal with this epistemic anarchy that's being described. Pure scientism, materialism, and atheism must fail. These are failed systems of sense-making. Christianity, Islam, Marxism, liberalism, neoliberalism, these will also fail. None of these paradigms are complex enough, rich enough, subtle enough, or profound enough to make sense of reality, because reality is beyond all these. Postmodernism is a response for handling all of this fragmentation, this epistemic anarchy, making sense of it. And the pre-modern and the modern are in denial about it. This denial is unhealthy, and it is ultimately untruthful. And if you keep pushing it, it's going to lead to more toxic and dysfunctional forms of human existence and behavior, which we will see play out in our politics, which we are experiencing to this day, right now. So if you're a modernist, my question to you is, what is your solution to the epistemic anarchy? What are you going to do? Domination? Claiming everyone is deluded and wrong and irrational? That tends to be what modernists do. Or you recognize that modernism is just limited and you got to go beyond modernism. Notice that everybody, how convenient that everybody thinks that their worldview is the truest and best, and so do you. And you think that the solution here is just to double down in your belief in your worldview and just to insist that your worldview is the right one and everybody else is just an idiot? You can sense that there's something wrong with that. And there is, because it's not truthful. It sidesteps the issue of relativity. If you think your worldview is the truth, you will use it to dominate others and to violate their sovereignty. This is also a huge problem with modernism. Fundamentally, it is anti-spiritual because it violates the sovereignty of others by not recognizing the validity of their point of view and their constructions. Everyone tries to monopolize using their point of view. And this ultimately ends up being anti-spiritual and anti-consciousness. Because consciousness is about infinite diversity of points of view. And the sovereignty of each mind. That's really way beyond the scope of this episode to understand what that means. So see, when someone says there's only two genders, they're not just stating empirical facts, scientific, biological facts, as a modernist would like you to believe. All of that is just a ruse. What's really happening is that this notion of there are only two genders, that's being weaponized by the mind for its own survival. If it wasn't, it wouldn't have any meaning or value to you. You wouldn't get triggered by it. You wouldn't care about it. You wouldn't be passionate about it. The reason people are passionate about this whole gender debate is only because it plays such a pivotal role in their entire sense-making scheme. Because of what it means for epistemology and for metaphysics. Because of what it means for your moral system. Because it threatens all of these. To admit that there's not just two genders threatens all of that. And so people try to play out this debate as though they're debating science. You're not debating science. You're not debating biology. That's not what's going on. What you're doing is your mind is engaging in a game of survival. And see, now you start to see that knowledge and truth are not merely neutral empirical statements of fact or some sort of idealized scientific pursuit of pure understanding. No. These are tools of power. And you see this. You see in the political ads and campaigns that are being run to win elections. These issues are being weaponized. When the conservatives are running anti-trans ads, it's not because they care about science or biology. Isn't this obvious? And it's not because they care about truth either. They don't care about truth. Nobody who votes for Trump cares about truth. This is absurd. What they're doing is they're playing their survival game. It's a game of survival. It's a game of denial. It's a game of construction. Creating mental constructions and then reinforcing those constructions because those constructions help you to hold power, to make money, to get fame, to get sex, to get all the things that the ego wants. That's what we mean when we say in postmodernism that knowledge is a tool for power. Some of the ideas that, for example, what's his name? Foucault popularized. But this goes way beyond Foucault. Here's another problem for modernists is that going back to modernism and the pre-modern is not a serious solution. You can't unsee the things you see through psychedelics. You can't unsee cultural diversity when you travel the world and you see the multiplicity and diversity of different cultures, different economic systems, different political regimes, beyond just Western Judeo-Christian neoliberalism. You can't unsee that. You can't unsee construct awareness. Once you realize that religion is a construct, you can't unsee that. And once you realize science is a construct, you can't unsee that. And once you realize that objectivity and rationality and even truth, that these values are actually constructs for human survival purposes, you can't unsee that. You can't go back to believing myths, and you can't go back to looking at the world through a single lens. And you can't keep just monopolizing, dominating, demonizing, dismissing, and denying other points of view, other paradigms. You can't just be a hardcore scientist and rationalist for your whole life. The these things must all collapse. And so this strategy of just like a turtle sticking your head in your shell and putting up your defenses, like what Jordan Peterson does, what the right wing does, this is not a healthy, proper response to the larger problem of making sense of reality. And it leads to dysfunction and toxicity. Science and rationality are not enough to understand reality. Scientific rigor is a bias. Objectivity is a bias. Truth even is a bias. Intellectual honesty is a bias. Academic standards are a bias. Survival and effectiveness are biases. And the problem with rationality is that there's not a single application of it. There's a multitude, a cornucopia of different applications of rationality. There's not a unified rationality. That's a myth. And even though we can have a sort of a pseudo-objective values and principles that can exist for humankind, they can be actualized in endless ways. And your way is not the best way or the only way. For example, we can have a notion of objectivity. It's good for us to have as mankind, as a global culture, it's good for us to have a notion of objectivity and to value objectivity, to try to be objective in our consumption of the news, in the way that we speak and debate with each other and so forth. It's good to be objective. But you have to see that that will get actualized in endlessly different ways. There's not one single notion of objectivity. It's going to be infected with relativity. So pre-modernist and modernist thinking leads to gross, sloppy, narrative abstractions and various kinds of epistemic bubbles. Simplistic totalizing theories are very common, for example, on the right wing, but even on the left, with Marxism, for example. These are all some of the problems of modernism that I'm pointing out to you, the deepest problems. Another one of those problems is that post-rationality and meta-rationality are real things. These are stages of cognitive development that you can reach. Another problem is that human bias corrupts all human knowledge. Here are some questions for the modernist. How are you handling relativity? Relativity of morality, perspective, culture, value, meaning, interpretation, perception, consciousness, neurodiversity? How are you handling construction? The constructed nature of human understanding of things. How are you handling the entanglement of mind and world? How are you handling ethnocentrism? How are you handling human bias, the problem of human bias? Are your systems self-reflexive? Are your systems able to doubt themselves, to question their own assumptions? How are you handling the sovereignty of other consciousnesses? You see, these are such profound questions. You ask these questions of any modernist or pre-modernist, they're going to look at you like a chimpanzee. They're not going to know. They're not going to have answers to any of these questions because they've never thought about these things before. All they are doing is just acting defensive, defending their prejudices, defending their paradigms, surviving. They're not thinking, they're not truth-seeking, they're not developing their mind to more advanced, sophisticated ways of understanding things. But if you seriously wanted to debate modernism versus postmodernism, as a modernist, you would need to have answers to all of these questions, is what I'm telling you. You would need to acknowledge that meaning is definitely constructed and relative. You would need to acknowledge that good and bad are relative to a self. And in the end, if you think through all this stuff, what you'll come to realize is that neither modernism nor pre-modernism has solutions to these profound epistemic problems. which is why postmodernism is necessary. Something has to come beyond modernism. Just as modernism had to come after pre-modernism. Because pre-modernism was incapable of making sense of reality. And nor is modernism. But now that you understand all that, might take you a decade to understand all that. But assuming you do that, now let's talk about how postmodernism is wrong. Because I laid out a really strong case so far for postmodernism. It might seem like, man, Leo, so you're a postmodernist then? Well, now I have a huge list for you of everything that's wrong. So here we go. Postmodernism is wrong, first and foremost, in that truth exists. Truth exists. Absolute truth exists. But absolute truth doesn't mean what you think it means. It's not what Christians say it is. It's not what science says it is, or any of that. Even though absolute truth exists, that does not contradict the enormous relativity of consciousness that we've been talking about. So it might seem like this is sort of a contradiction. It's not. Truth exists, and the truth is that consciousness is extremely relative. That's the truth. So fundamentally, postmodernists don't understand what truth is. Nobody really understands what truth is because that requires awakening. But yeah, they really don't understand what truth is. And here's why that is. Because they are lost in what I call second order truth. There's two orders of truth. There's first order, second order. First order truth is what we would call absolute truth. That is direct experience in a nutshell. Direct experience, consciousness itself, is absolute truth. That's first order. The first order is occurring regardless of what you think about it or how you're thinking. Second order comes online when you're able to conceptualize, when you can make concepts about the first order. So the first order is sort of like base reality. Then from that, you can think about base reality. You can draw conclusions. You can pick out patterns. You can attach meanings to things and put values on things. And you can conceptualize. So the entire conceptual domain of mind is second order. Now, within second order, you can have truths or falsehoods. For example, you can look at the first order. Let's say we're out in the winter looking at the snow. The snow and the trees, the environment we're in, that's first order truth. Second order truth is that we look at the snow and we say, snow is white. Our saying that, our thinking that, that's the second order. That's the concept. Snow is white. Now, there's some connection between first order and second order. They're obviously connected in some way, but it's not obvious exactly how they're connected, because you could have a different concept. You could say snow is blue, and then depending on how you're interpreting that, that could be true or false. And so conceptually, you can have falsehoods or truths. That's all happening at the second order. So the problem for postmodernists is that they don't even understand that there is a first order. They completely ignore the first order, and they're lost in the second order. They're lost in concepts and language. And that's a big problem. That's a big problem when you're disconnected from absolute truth, when you're disconnected from the first order, because the first order grounds the second order. Postmodernism is wrong in that genuine understanding of reality is possible beyond culture, language, and humanity. Postmodernism tends to assume that that's not possible. This sort of idea that there is no view from nowhere. You're always situated in a culture, a postmodernist would say, and you're always biased by that culture and looking at the world through that culture, and you can never escape that culture, your language, and even being human. That's false. You can escape these things. It's very hard, In practice, nobody ever escapes these things, but it is actually possible to transcend these things. Even your humanity can be transcended. That's a possibility that postmodernists simply are missing. That's a big thing to miss. What else postmodernism is wrong about is that insight and understanding are real. Insight is not a social construct. Consciousness is not a social construct. Consciousness is the first order absolute truth base layer of reality. Consciousness is reality. Social constructions occur within consciousness. Consciousness itself is not a social construction. Humans can have beliefs about consciousness and about the world. When I say the world, I just mean consciousness. Consciousness takes on infinite forms. When you're walking through a forest, you're walking through consciousness. So you can have all sorts of beliefs about the forest that you're walking through. You could believe it's good, you could believe it's evil, whatever you want. But when you're walking through that forest, that is not a social construction. That's consciousness. Postmodernists miss that, even though it's so obvious, they miss it. Because they're so lost in concepts in the second order. And you can have beliefs. Beliefs are happening at the level of the second order. Beliefs are concepts. But insight is not the same thing as a belief, and it's not the same thing as knowledge. I have an episode called Something Something Insight. What is insight? Go check that out for more on what insight is, where we separate insight from all the other stuff that the human mind does. But insight is something transcendental. Insight is coming from beyond the human. Postmodernism misses that. When you have an insight into how some aspect of consciousness works, that is not merely a theory, that is not merely knowledge, that is not merely a belief, that is not merely a worldview, that is something beyond that, something more genuine, more truthful. That's my claim. Postmodernism is wrong in placing language and the social domain above consciousness. Not everything is linguistic. In fact, most things are not linguistic. And you have to be very careful not to boil down your understanding of reality just to linguistic functions of the mind. This is a huge mistake. Modernists make this mistake, but postmodernists still make this mistake. Maybe even more so, because they're just so wrapped up in language. Language points to first-order truths and insights at its best, not always, at its best. Language, of course, can be used to deceive, which is usually its function, but it can point to first-order truths. Language connects to first-order reality, to consciousness, and it's not merely circular and hollow, a collection of symbols, as postmodernists and post-structuralists like to say. And language, furthermore, gets imbued with understanding. And understanding is not the same thing as belief, knowledge, or worldview. Understanding is something more profound. So postmodernism misses understanding, and it misses reference experience. Language is not just a collection of symbols like a dictionary. Language also connects with reference experiences. To understand reality, to understand what language is being talked about, you need reference experiences. That's the connection of the second order to the first order. That's the grounding of it. And so postmodernism, by losing that grounding, yes, it does become ungrounded, and that does lead to delusions. And modernists are correct to make fun of certain postmodernists for saying certain silly things, because they do become ungrounded eventually, just lost in language and concepts in the second order. In this sense, modernists have a sort of an intuitive sense that there is a first order. What they call the first order is just physical reality. What modernists get wrong, though, is that this first order is not a static physical objective reality. It's a much more, it's mind. It's mind. It's hallucinations. The first order is made out of hallucinations, absolute hallucinations, but hallucinations. So what modernism misses is that first order is a hallucination. Modernism thinks first order is reality. It's hallucination. Reality is hallucination. So it misses that. But then postmodernism misses the first order. Where else postmodernism is wrong is that social construction is second order. Social, the entire social domain, is really a construction of consciousness, which is first order. So there's actually something deeper than social construction, which is mental construction. The social domain is a construct of the mental domain of mind. Mind with a capital M. This is what postmodernism misses. The entire social domain is imaginary. The entire domain in which postmodernism takes place, the domain of language, the domain of humankind, the domain of society. I'm telling you that society is a hallucination. Postmodernists don't understand this. And so they make the mistake of placing the social domain above the domain of consciousness and mind, pure mind, absolute mind. Mind comes first, the social domain comes second. The social domain is contingent upon mind with a capital M. The reason postmodernists make this mistake is that most of postmodernist science and sense-making, what they're trying to make sense of is they're usually trying to make sense of social domains. They're trying to make sense of sociology, psychology, politics, economics, literature. These are the domains that postmodernists usually work within. But of course, all those domains are they assume the social domain. So postmodernists take the social domain for granted, ironically. And then they make the mistake of saying that, well, you can never escape the social domain because you're always inside of a society and a culture. Actually, you can. How? Not by physically removing yourself from the social domain, but by becoming so conscious that you realize that the social domain was a construct of your mind the entire time. You hallucinated the social domain. So of course you can escape the social domain. Just realize it's a hallucination. You don't need to physically escape it. When you think that you need to physically escape the social domain to escape the social domain, that assumes the social domain is real. That's the assumption that you never questioned as a postmodernist. So the key mistake of postmodernism is placing the social over consciousness. Also, what postmodernism gets wrong is that the self is prior to the social domain. Now, of course, in practice, postmodernists are correct in that the social domain has such a huge influence on the self, on the mind. Most humans are nothing more than just creatures of groupthink and herd mentality. And they just are nothing more than the social domain. Most humans think and believe just what others around them think and believe. So in this sense, postmodernists are correct that you can't escape the social domain. But that's not strictly speaking true, because if you develop yourself high enough, if you do this work that I'm sharing with you, then the whole point of this work is actually to deconstruct the mind so deeply that you even deconstruct the existence of a social domain. And then you free yourself of the social domain. Now, not entirely. I'm not saying I'm free of the social domain, but at least temporarily, you can break out of the social domain within your own mind, and you can reach the self, which is prior to the social domain. This is kind of like self with a capital S. So that's being missed by postmodernists. Now, a postmodernist must say, but Leo, isn't self, mind, consciousness, and God, aren't these just man-made linguistic categories? And the answer is no, they're not. That's the power of this work, is that these things are not man-made linguistic categories, even though, of course, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of man-made conceptual baggage that is intermixed with these words and concepts. So yes, mind, God, consciousness, and self, these can be concepts. They are concepts, but these are concepts that point to something that's beyond concepts. So postmodernism is way too lost in language, treating reality and mind as though it was just a linguistic thing. No, mind is prior to linguistics. Consciousness is pre-linguistic. And understanding and insight is more fundamental than language, even though it employs language. So I'm not necessarily saying that you can completely transcend the use of language. It's not about that per se, because I'm using language right now. And you can say, well, Leo, you're using language to explain all this stuff. Yes, exactly. The difference between you and me, if you're a postmodernist, is that I understand that even though I'm using language as a medium, I understand that there's something deeper than that that's actually flowing through the medium, whereas the postmodernist thinks that there's just the medium, lost in the medium. Many even non-dualists make this mistake. This is such a profound mistake to make. It's like, if you want God to speak to you, God is going to need a medium to speak to you through. Language, some kind of language, symbols, it could be anything. It doesn't have to even be language. It could just be pictures or something. Depending on how you define language, you could say that that is language or it's not language. Definitions of language can vary and be relative of themselves. But see, for God to communicate with you in any way, it has to go from formless to form. As it's taking on that form, it needs some medium. People then, when that communication is happening, people then confuse the medium for the thing that's behind the medium. And in this way, they either don't recognize God, don't see God, or they get so fixated on the particular manifestation of that God's communication that they hold that as the only communication. For example, this is the problem with Islam. In Islam, God communicated through Muhammad through the medium of the Quran, and that is the one true communication, and everything else is wrong or isn't true or isn't valid or isn't as good. See, that's the mistake. You've confused the medium of the communication for the actual essence behind it. The next thing that postmodernists get wrong is that distinctions are not human-made. Distinctions are more fundamental than human. They're more than linguistic. They're more than conceptual. In fact, linguistic, conceptual, and man-made, these themselves are distinctions. These are distinctions within mind that are being dreamed up. Postmodernists are wrong in that atheism is false and God is not a social construct. Most postmodernists are atheists. This is wrong. How can God not be a social construct? Well, God is consciousness. This is God. The very mind that you are using to do your postmodern philosophy is God, and that is not a social construct. So the postmodernist is wrong because there is God, there is love, there is intelligence, there is goodness in the absolute sense that is beyond relativity, and there is the transcendental. Postmodernists generally deny the existence of a transcendental. Of course, there is a transcendental. Transcendental is truth, consciousness, God, love, infinity. That's what postmodernism is most wrong about. That's what it's missing. Postmodernism is missing spirituality. Postmodernism is missing an understanding of metaphysical love with a capital L, which I've described elsewhere. Postmodernism is missing that relativity is a profound aspect of the absolute. So this very distinction between absolute and relative is got wrong by both postmodernists and by modernists and by pre-modernists, because this is such a hairy, thorny, tricky, deceptive distinction to get right. What is the relationship between the relative and the absolute? Almost nobody can explain that to you. Because to understand that, you would need to be very, very awake. Postmodernism is wrong in that higher intelligence is not just relative. Higher intelligence gets you access to genuine insight, understanding, and absolute truth. Intelligence is not just a human feature. Intelligence is a feature of the universe of consciousness. So it's not linguistic. It's way more profound than language. And postmodernists are wrong in that higher consciousness is not relative either. You can be more conscious than you currently are. That's true. That's not relative. That's not human. That's not linguistic. That's not conceptual. You can be more conscious, or you can be less conscious too. If I hit you over the head with a baseball bat, you'll be less conscious. If you get Alzheimer's, you'll be less conscious. Postmodernism is wrong in that not all perspectives are equally valid or of equal intelligence, quality, or development level. So yes, we have this multiplicity of different perspectives, but we have a wide variety of quality of these perspectives. And not all these perspectives come from the same levels of consciousness and development and intelligence. Not all value systems are equally viable. So yes, we have all these different value systems that are possible, but whether something's going to be viable and work in the real world and enable the survival of itself as a system and also those who hold it, humans who hold these systems, that's a very different matter. Certain values will work for certain survival situations and not for others. Postmodernists tend to miss this. This is the mistake of over-relativizing certain things. It's like, well, all cultures are equally valid. No. Some cultures are toxic and lead to nuclear annihilation of the entire planet. Some cultures are genocidal. Now you could say, but Leo, didn't you say that nuclear war and genocide are themselves relative values? So in a sense, if some culture leads to the nuclear annihilation of the planet, well, that's relative, and so what? Yes, that's a good point. It's important to understand that point. That is absolutely true, is that in a higher sense, a culture that is genocidal, even that, in a sense, is not objectively bad, and there's nothing wrong with it per se. But, so in that sense, it's relative, but what's missed by a lot of relativists is that relative to the game of survival, which most of us are playing and most of us care about, including you relativists and postmodernists, you care about your survival. I'll bet you that. As long as you care about survival, relative to the game of survival, not all value systems are equal. So in that sense, we can say that a genocidal, nuclear holocaust culture or value system is inferior. Not because it's objectively absolutely inferior, but it's inferior relative to the game of survival that we as humans are mostly all on board with, trying to, play that game. Postmodernism is wrong in its inability to make strong truth claims, excessive relativism, abuses of relativism. So, for example, if I claim to know absolute truth, most postmodernists would hear that and say, that can't be true, you must be wrong or deluded. But it is true that I have access to absolute truth, and you can too. That's something postmodernism is missing. Postmodernism wants to say, well, Leo, but that's so arrogant of you to say that you have access to absolute truth. How arrogant is that, to think that you have that? That's because most people who claim to have access to absolute truth, they're just lost in concepts and beliefs. When a Christian says that Christianity is absolute truth, that's not what I'm talking about. So there's a fake absolute truth and there's a real absolute truth, and you have to be very careful about that. And also you have to be careful about what you conceive absolute truth to be. So when I say absolute truth or that I have access to absolute truth, you probably don't understand what I mean, what I'm actually pointing to, because you lack that reference experience. So you are likely to misinterpret what I'm saying. So I probably don't mean what you think I mean. And if you're saying to yourself, well, Leo, you're being awfully vague and evasive, why don't you just tell us what you mean? Well, because the nature of absolute truth, the real absolute truth, is that you can't say, there's no way for me to say it to you, because it's transcendental. It's beyond language. So part of the mistake of the whole postmodernism thing is that you're just assuming that language can capture all of reality, which of course it can't. So real absolute truth is beyond linguistic capture. Not a mistake. That's how it has to be. So see, a postmodernist is incapable of just saying that I know absolute truth. A postmodernist can't say that, whereas I can. And now you got to ask the question, well, who's right? Is the postmodernist right or is Leo right? How do I know? Well, for that, you would need to test whether you can ever actually access absolute truth. If you can, then you'll know that I was right. But until you do that, you won't know. So I'm not saying that you should believe me. I'm just saying that this is a possibility you can test. Requires awakening. Awakening would be you realizing that I was right. That sounds very self-serving of me to say, Leo, how dare you say that awakening means that you're right. But well, when you awaken, you'll realize I was right. And if you don't, then you never will. I mean, it's kind of funny, but like this is deadly serious stuff here. It's so serious that I make light of it because there's no better way to communicate it to you. So another problem with postmodernism is that postmodernists are lost in a sort of aperspectival madness, a nihilism, unable to assert sovereignty of mind. Because for postmodernists, knowledge is really a social game. Remember that quote from part 1 where Richard Rorty said something along the lines of, truth is what your colleagues let you get away with? That's the problem with postmodernism, is that that's how they conceive of truth. Because they're just so lost in the social, conceptual, second-order domain that for them, truth is just like literally what society, various consensus within society. Whereas I'm saying that truth is not that. And so because of this, the postmodernist hesitates to actually assert truth, to make a definitive truth claim, whereas I don't have such compunctions. Now, it's dangerous because you can make a firm truth claim and you can be wrong, because you can misunderstand absolute truth. You can claim that something is absolute truth when it isn't. That's usually what people do. So postmodernists are correct in identifying that that's a big problem, but they are incorrect in that they tend to think that that's the only way it can happen. It can only go down as somebody being arrogant and narcissistic and claiming absolute truth and then dominating you with their perspective. That's the only way you can make an absolute truth claim. But what I'm saying is that there's an alternative possibility, is that you can make an absolute truth claim which is absolutely true. And it's not coming from narcissism or egotism or limited perspective or a kind of a domination, but it's just absolutely true. So that's a possibility that you could open your mind to and you could validate for yourself with some work. Postmodernism tends to be wrong in that it misses what I call pseudo-objectivity. What is pseudo-objectivity? There can be sort of objective truths relative to human consciousness in the game of survival. We've sort of just discussed this with that example. For example, I might call these pseudo-universal human values. So for example, truth, love, consciousness, integrity, selflessness, honesty, transparency, anti-corruption, anti-bias, objectivity, respect for the sovereignty of other consciousnesses and minds. These would be examples of what I call pseudo-universal truths, pseudo-universal human values. Why do I call them pseudo? Because ultimately, in the absolute sense, nothing is forcing you to value any of these things. You don't have to value consciousness. You don't have to value integrity. You don't have to value honesty. You could be a dirty, rotten, corrupt liar and live your whole life that way. And in the absolute sense, there's nothing wrong with that. So, but assuming that you want to live a good life, assuming you want a peaceful, healthy society, assuming some of these things, assuming survival, assuming you want to actually develop yourself and make sense of reality, these are some big assumptions. Most people don't care about any of this stuff. But assuming you want these things, then some of these values, these pseudo-values, we can treat them temporarily as though they're objective truths and objective values. For example, if you want to make sense of reality, and you want to maximize love, and you want to maximize fairness and equality among society, and you want to understand everybody's worldviews so that you're not confused and in denial about them, then what I would say is that you can treat the following values as objective: truth, love, consciousness, integrity, honesty, and so forth. Non-manipulation is another one. Non-exploitation. Predictive value, objectivity, neutrality, reduction of ego, hard work, excellence, creativity, intelligence, coherence. All of these are what I would call pseudo-universal values. What I would say is that even if there are alien species living in other star systems, as long as their minds work remotely close to ours and they care about certain things that we care about, if they want to live peacefully, for example, if they want to understand us and themselves and other alien species in the world, then they need to have some of these values. And in that sense, we're saying that these are kind of like objective. By kind of like, I mean pseudo-objective. In practice, these values function as true because most humans have similar states of consciousness. If every human had a radically different state of consciousness, then we couldn't converge on some of these basic principles and truths. But since most of us think in similar ways, have similar needs, most of us care about survival, not just our own, but we care about the survival of our tribe, our family, our nation, and even the world. Most of us care about these things. Most of us care about having love in our life. Most of us care about fairness and equality to a certain degree, right? If you care about these things like most humans do, if you're not a psychopath or something, or you're not insane, then in that sense, we could come together and agree on some of these pseudo-objective values. And the pursuit of this would lead to a better society. Now, again, nothing says that we should work towards a better society. We don't have to. But assuming that most of us want a better society, this would be how we got it, through these principles and values. Another problem with postmodernism is that the loss of rationality and ground make it impossible to adjudicate disagreements. If not impossible, then just make it harder. See, one of the functions of something like science being treated as objective, or rationality is being treated as objective and universal, is that then we can use science and rationality to adjudicate disputes. If you believe this thing and I believe that thing, we can make an appeal to science and rationality to adjudicate that dispute. But if, for example, I might believe in climate change and maybe you don't believe in climate change, but we can come together, and if we both agree that science and rationality are good and valuable things, then we can open a science textbook and we can maybe find a resolution to this disagreement about climate change in the science textbook. Now, of course, even there's problems because scientists can disagree and there's different textbooks. So how do you know which textbook to pick? But assuming those issues aside, let's say all of scientists agree that climate change is real. See, we can make an appeal to that. But if you're a radical postmodernist, you would say, but Leo, why should we take science as absolute truth? After all, science is just one dominant position. Science is just a construction of of Western patriarchy or something like that. And therefore, science, who's to say that science is any better than voodoo or astrology or some New Age belief system? Well, if you want to take that radical relativistic position, there's some value in doing that in a certain sense, but also something will be lost because what's happening is that you're becoming so ungrounded. And what's being lost is that now it's impossible for us to adjudicate any dispute. Because I might say climate change is real because it's scientific, it's a scientific fact. And you might say, yeah, it's a scientific fact, but I don't accept that science as a methodology is any better than voodoo. And so therefore, climate change isn't happening. And the mistake that a modernist makes is the modernist says, well, that's all just bullshit. Obviously voodoo is bullshit, and obviously science is is objectively true. That's a mistake. That's not really what's going on. What's really going on is that, yes, if you want, you can believe voodoo over science. You can value voodoo over science. But remember that you are playing a game of survival in the end. And nothing says that voodoo will be equally viable as a survival game as science. So here is where really the dispute is resolved. The dispute is not resolved at the theoretical, conceptual, metaphysical, epistemological level of what's true, what's false. It's resolved at the level of survival. If you believe in voodoo and voodoo tells you that climate change isn't real, then you'll probably end up destroying the planet and dying along with it. And so will all your beliefs. All your postmodern beliefs will die with it as well. Whereas if you believe in science, science is probably correct about there being problems with climate change, and science can create technologies to fix those problems and therefore aid in the game of survival. So remember, as a postmodernist, you're not so philosophical and so neutral as a postmodernist that you don't care about survival. Survival, in fact, skews your whole doing of postmodernism, and you have to recognize that postmodernism itself is really a game within a larger game of survival. Another problem with postmodernism is that it doesn't understand developmental stages very well. And it tends to have problems handling stages like spiral dynamic stage red or purple, or even stages beyond stage green, yellow, turquoise. If you don't know what these stages are, go see my series called Spiral Dynamics. But see, if you're overly relativistic, as postmodernists tend to be, then they don't want to say that one worldview is more developed than another worldview because that seems like it's a domination. Developed means better, superior, and then that just is a recapitulation of all the problems of modernism, where modernism had these sort of chauvinistic tendencies towards marginalized perspectives. This is a mistake, though, because there is such a thing as higher stages of development. But you have to be careful about what that means. It doesn't mean necessarily that higher is good or better in some objective sense. Higher just means more complex, more sophisticated, better at sense making. Higher levels of abstraction, higher levels of awareness. Now again, these are not necessarily objectively superior things. Just because you can make better sense of the world and your mind is more abstract and more complex doesn't necessarily mean anything. But as long as you care about these things, then it does matter. And also it does have influence on survival. Remember that people surviving at low stages of development, they could easily kill themselves. They do war, they do genocide, they have slavery, all all sorts of nasty stuff like this, racism, are more prevalent at the lower stages. That's what distinguishes the higher stages from the lower stages, is the higher stages outgrow that stuff. So as long as you care about eliminating slavery, racism, genocide, abuse of women, child abuse, these sorts of things, then higher stages of development are better relative to your caring about eliminating those things. Now, should you care about eliminating those things? Not in any absolute sense. You don't have to care. In fact, you could want those things. You could benefit from all those things. Slavery could be good for you as long as you're on the receiving end of it. I mean, in the sense that you're getting the benefits of it. You're not the one who's being enslaved. So, it all depends. It all depends on kind of like what you want out of life. There are many people in the world who benefit from sexual abuse, which is why sexual abuse exists and will continue to exist for 1,000 years to come. So in a sense, sexual abuse is relative. Sexual abuse is not bad because many people benefit from it. That's why it exists. Sexual abuse is bad for those who are being abused, but it's not bad for the abusers. But then again, it also is bad for the abusers in a certain higher dimension because that has a cost on your consciousness too. Again, assuming you care about consciousness. Of course, a sexual abuser doesn't care about consciousness, so for him, maybe it's fine. He doesn't feel the cost. But if you do care about consciousness, you'll feel the cost and create problems for you. So see how many layers there are to this kind of stuff? To be able to think in the ways that I'm demonstrating here for you what I'm demonstrating for you is higher stages of development. Stages of development that are both beyond modern and beyond postmodern. So when you're hearing me talk in this kind of like nuanced, weird way, and you're wondering like, why is he talking this way? Because this is how an advanced mind thinks. Because I don't have a simple solution for you. Some stupid, simple, dumb Jordan Peterson solution by appealing to Christianity or some stupid Bible story, right? This is not that. This is real. Like this is a real confrontation with the complexities of sense-making, of epistemology, of metaphysics, of reality, of consciousness. Postmodernism can have a problem with a lack of tolerance towards lower stages of development, missing this notion of spiral wizardry, which I talked about in my Spiral Dynamics series. Postmodernism misses that truth is ground. And if you deny truth, you must become ungrounded and ultimately corrupt. Life without truth leads to degeneracy, fantasy, self-deception, narcissism, human games, social delusions, collective hallucinations, and pretense. And postmodern philosophy is guilty of a lot of this. Why? Because fundamentally it doesn't recognize truth as ground, and therefore it's ungrounded. After all, how convenient for you is it to deny that there is a ground? If you deny that there is a ground, if you're able to convince yourself that there is no ground in that anything goes, any worldview, any perspective, it's as good as any other, in a certain sense. This is a bit of a straw man of postmodernism, but sort of in a certain sense. If you reach that point in your thinking, then can you see how convenient that is? Because then you don't have to work to keep yourself grounded, because keeping yourself grounded, if there is a ground, comes with huge emotional labor. It's not anything goes. You can't just believe whatever you want. Not every culture, not every perspective is correct. Not every one of them is equally viable. Not all of them lead to truth. Not all of them lead to understanding of God. Not all of them lead to valid philosophy. So just the recognition that there is a ground is very inconvenient for the ego mind. Abandoning the attempt for objectivity and neutrality leads to an unleashing of bias. This is one of the performative contradictions of postmodernism, is that in a sense, postmodernism arose because it sees the bias within modernist perspective. That's correct, that's valid. However, then postmodernism turns into this thing where even objectivity and neutrality are in a sense recognized as being a kind of a bias, and therefore they are abandoned because, hey, if objectivity and neutrality are biases, just Western male biases, let's just abandon those. But then what are you left with? In practice, then you're left with an unleashing of all standards, and then bias runs rampant. And in practice, what happens is that many postmodernist thinkers are not less biased than modernist ones. They're more biased. They're just biased in new and different ways. They're biased, for example, towards Marxism or socialism. Marxism and socialism, that's a bias. If you were truly postmodern, you would not subscribe to those. But in practice, many postmodernists do. Why? Because they have let go of the ground and these higher standards of objectivity and neutrality, which were established in modernism. The problem is that modernism was corrupt. So modernist versions of neutrality and objectivity were not truly neutral and objective. The postmodernists recognized that, but then made the mistake of saying, well, then we don't need objectivity and neutrality at all because it's all just bullshit. Objectivity and neutrality, that's just what powerful people use to maintain their power. Not entirely true. Often that's the case. Usually that's the case. Maybe in 95% of the times that's the case. But that 5%, when it's not the case, that's important. That's hugely important because without that, you're lost. You're completely lost in nothing more than power games. So the key mistake that postmodernism makes is that it misses that which is beyond human games, social games, power games, survival games, which is truth, God, transcendence, consciousness, love. Postmodernism introduces its own biases, such as social justice and political activism, deconstruction, that's a bias, atheism, that's a bias, Marxism. Various marginalized perspectives are maybe over-elevated, right? See, originally, postmodernism had the intention of taking marginalized perspectives which were demonized and denigrated and just elevating them so that they're at parity with the mainstream perspective. That's a good intention. But then what can happen is that you can go overboard to the point where it's like you have the white male Western patriarchy here, then you have maybe minority black women voices here, but then what happens is that you elevate them to parity and then beyond parity to the point where you might think that when it comes to sense making, the black female perspective is more important than the white patriarchy perspective. And then there's where you're going to go wrong. Another bias is a bias against hierarchy. Hierarchies can be unfair and biased. Postmodernism recognizes that, but then it wants to deconstruct all hierarchies and flatten them all, but then that in itself becomes its own sort of oppressive regime and a bias. Because in truth, there is some value in hierarchies. Hierarchies don't just exist simply to serve powerful, selfish people. Hierarchies exist for much more profound reasons. Humans are social creatures who organize themselves into hierarchies because we have different capacities and not everyone can be at the top of the hierarchy. Somebody has to lead. Ideally, the person who leads is the one who's most experienced, most wise, most truthful, most conscious, and understands, the situation the best. Now, that's not always the case. That's corruption if that's not the case. But that's still an ideal that we should strive for. You see, certain ideals of modernism, even though they were never lived up to, are still good as ideals and still need to be honored and valued. The ideal of objectivity, the ideal of neutrality, the ideal of meritocracy, these are important ideals, even though they were badly corrupted under modernism. But if you get rid of these ideals under a postmodernist regime, that could be even worse. That could lead to even worse crimes and outrages and injustices. So this is very tricky terrain here. There's also a bias in postmodernism of this bias towards subversiveness and transgressiveness, undermining all human constructions and systems. There is some value to questioning systems, deconstructing hierarchies, deconstructing worldviews. There's definitely value to that. But if you turn that into like your only method, that itself then leads to all sorts of perversions and crimes and problems. So you have to be very careful about that. The goal is not to be maximally subversive and transgressive and weird and queer. That's not the goal. The goal is the pursuit of truth and consciousness and love. That's the real goal. Don't get confused about that. And if you say, well, Leo, why is that the real goal? Who are you to say what the real goal is? Maybe the real goal is just to be maximally queer. Again, given relativity, I can't force upon you the goal of truth and love and consciousness, but if your goal is to be maximally queer and you put that above love, truth, and consciousness, what's going to happen is bad stuff. Now you can say, well, Leo, bad is relative. Yes, it is. But again, you're not so queer that you're above bad stuff and that you're above survival and that you're above the evils and crimes and injustices that will happen from your twisted philosophy. It's like you say, but Leo, twisted philosophy, that's just relative. Who are you to say what's twisted? Again, there is a truth. Remember, there's an absolute truth. There's a consciousness. There's higher consciousness. There's higher intelligence. Well, Leo, that's relative. No, higher intelligence is not relative. That's the mistake of postmodernism. If you, as a postmodernist, reject empiricism and logical coherence as being biased, then anything goes. And then it's very easy to bullshit. So see, you have to be very careful how your ego will use postmodernism because it's so convenient to reject things like logical coherence. If you want to be strictly relativist, you can say, well, Leo, being logically coherent versus being logically incoherent, who's to say that one is better than the other? And in an absolute sense, you're right. Absolutely speaking, there's nothing wrong about being logically incoherent. However, remember, you don't live in the absolute, you live in the relative. And everybody around you that you live with, your community, is living in the relative, not in the absolute. They're not living in your philosophy. They're living in mundane human survival conditions and reality, where logical incoherence will lead to survival problems. Survival problems lead to suffering. Now you might say, well, Leo, suffering, that's relative. Who's to say suffering is bad? Yeah, you can say that when you're sitting there in comfort. But if I take a gun and shoot you in the foot, you will quickly appreciate why suffering is bad. See, you're not conscious enough, if I shoot you in the foot, to understand that suffering is a construction of your mind. You're not conscious enough to do that, even though it is. The suffering is a hallucination, but you don't know that. You're nowhere near developed and conscious enough to appreciate that a hole in your foot is a hallucination. See, you're going to want relief from that suffering. And in that sense, I'm protecting you here from your own, stupidity of misusing postmodernism and conflating absolute and relative issues. Because no matter what you say, in the end, after all of your philosophy is done, at the end of the day, what you care about is survival. Whether you're a postmodernist, modernist, pre-modernist, it's all survival for you. So in practice, what happens is that postmodernism devolves into human bullshit, drowning in the social domain. The social domain, as illusory and disconnected from reality as it is, gets even more disconnected under postmodernism. And that's a problem. Postmodernism gets weaponized to reject other people's truths, values, agendas, and their sovereignty of mind while imposing your own. So even though originally the intent behind the rise of postmodernism was to bring justice and equality to marginalized voices, that's where it starts. But because postmodernism is theoretically fundamentally disconnected from truth and from ground, because it rejects it and denies it, doesn't see it, the first order, what happens is that eventually all these good intentions get corrupted because the truth is gone. The ground is gone. There's nothing to ground yourself in. And so in practice, what happens is that the ego mind runs amok, survival runs amok, and what happens is that postmodernism gets co-opted by the ego mind in order to just push your worldview and perspective onto others. Therefore, postmodernism in practice turns into something like a toxic form of Marxism or identity politics or cancel culture or Me Too or whatever, this kind of stuff. You might say, well, Leo, but that's not really postmodernism at that point. Yeah, you're right. It's not postmodernism. Then again, it is postmodernism because the very nature of postmodernism, since it's disconnected from ground, its nature is that it can never be true. What's going to happen is that it's always going to get corrupted and twisted over time because you're playing games within the social domain. And so whatever good intentions there were is going to turn to shit in the same way that Marxism turns to shit. See, Marxism, in its ideal, is great. Everybody is equal. Resources are nicely distributed and shared. Nobody's exploiting anybody else. Nobody's taking excess profits in business. Everything is mutually owned, collective ownership of property. Sounds nice in practice. I mean, in theory. But in practice, when you implement it, what happens is not anything remotely like that. What happens is you get shit. You get shit. And so that's the real problem with postmodernism. Postmodernism becomes devilry. Postmodernism turns into ideology and groupthink. Postmodernism turns into a political ideology. And then postmodernism becomes just another tool for power and oppression. And so the people who were marginalized and then used postmodernism to rise up out of their marginality then become the new bullies and become the new devils because they never really understood the true source of corruption. The true source of corruption in modernism was not that it didn't hear enough black voices or female voices or whatever. The real source of all corruption is a disconnection from truth. The reason modernism was corrupt was because it was disconnected from truth. But postmodernism, see, modernism called things that were true as absolute truths, which they weren't. Then postmodernism rejects the whole idea of absolute truth and maybe even all truth altogether. But then that itself becomes untrue because there is an absolute truth. And so then that becomes the next order of corruption. And so really what corruption is a disconnection from truth. Whether that happens at the pre-modern, modern, or postmodern is irrelevant. You're still going to get evil and corruption because you're disconnected from truth. And postmodernism doesn't solve that problem. Doesn't even understand this problem. That's how bad it gets when you deny truth, the existence of truth. Postmodernism has a problem in that it overemphasizes power dynamics as though power dynamics are the only thing. Power dynamics are very significant, and knowledge, truth, objectivity, neutrality, science, rationality are all used for power. But that doesn't mean that those things are only used for power and nothing else. There is something else that they can be used for. Postmodernism makes a big mistake by placing social justice over truth. That seems like it would be okay to place social justice over truth. Like, I could ask you, what's more important, to have social justice and equality in society or to have truth? If you could only have one, which one would you have? A lot of postmodernists would pick the social justice over truth because they would say, well, Leo, truth doesn't even exist. So why would I even pick that? Truth is just a collection of different perspectives and micro narratives. So obviously social justice is preferred. But if you do that, you make a big mistake because social justice only has value to the extent that it's true. You're assuming that if you get social justice, that it's going to be true. But you could also get social justice, which is false, which is exactly what will happen if you abandon the notion of truth. So as soon as you abandon truth, that's automatically corruption. So by placing social justice over truth, you've corrupted your politics and you've corrupted your mind and you've corrupted your society. You just don't realize it yet. And the consequences yet have not percolated through, so you don't see them yet. It'll take a few decades for you to see it, but it will happen. So postmodernism also makes a mistake with the sort of social justice warrior identity. The emotional reactivity of social justice warriors. Now, there's an interesting question here. Are social justice warriors really postmodernists? And I would say that many of them are not. They're too immature, too inexperienced, too intellectually stupid. Actually, all they're doing is just political activism. They've been politically radicalized by some ideology, which is not really postmodernism. But in another sense, they are kind of products of postmodernism or postmodernity. So it really depends how you want to look at that. Another problem with postmodernism is the sort of ideological capture of universities that has happened. Now, again, you could say, well, strictly speaking, ideology shouldn't be part of postmodernism. Yeah, you're right, but in practice, what happens is that once you start to consume postmodernism, it does turn into an ideology. Because it's disconnected from truth and doesn't care about truth, doesn't care about objectivity, neutrality, cares about social justice, so that becomes a new ideology. And then that corrupts the education system. And then students become politically radicalized with this ideology. Postmodernism makes a mistake in equating the hard and soft sciences and literary criticism and stuff like sociology and politics. There is a difference between the hard and the soft sciences. There's some important differences. The hard sciences are more rigorous. They're more grounded. And that's something that postmodernists don't like to admit because, of course, they don't want to even admit that there is a ground. And in a certain higher sense, there isn't a ground, but also in a certain relative sense, there is a ground. Postmodernism makes the mistake which leads to a loss of empirical rigor. Hard science is important. And we're seeing a loosening of rigor in science. We're seeing a lot of low-quality scientific research. The problem with science is not that it's, well, there's multiple problems. Simultaneously, the problem with science is that it's simultaneously too rigorous and not rigorous enough. I discussed that in my Deconstructing the Myth of Science series. What is better, a modernist education or a postmodern education? In a certain sense, I would say a modernist education is better because modernism is a foundation for postmodernism. A lot of what's happening these days is that we have a lack of a modernist foundation and people are just skipping ahead over into postmodernism as an ideology. But there's a big difference between postmodernism as an ideology versus postmodernism as a stage of development that you have worked through by working through and exhausting the limits of modernism. Today's college kids, these political activists, social justice warriors have not done the serious work that I'm discussing here of comprehending and exhausting the limits of modernism. They've just skipped ahead over it as an ideology, and that leads to all sorts of toxic behavior and problems. So to get people to real postmodern, not postmodern, but even like post-rationality, this is the goal of this whole talk. To get you to post-rationality, first what we need to do is to get you a deep education in rationality and in modernism. And then you can go post-rational, but not until then. So a lot of this stuff that I'm talking about is way too advanced for most people. I'm talking about things here that are like PhD levels of sophistication and understanding. Most people just need basic education in simple science, simple rationality, simple epistemic rigor and standards, simple notions of objectivity and neutrality, ethics, this kind of like just basic stuff. Most people are just missing this basic stuff. Then once you get all that for 5, 10, 20 years, then you can outgrow beyond it into the post-rational. So please understand that what's being discussed here is like so advanced, so advanced that for most of you, this is unnecessary and in fact counterproductive. The work that I'm putting out now is like for the most advanced top 0.001% of mankind. And it will be counterproductive to those who are not there yet, not ripe for this kind of teaching. But this is my passion, is I like teaching the most advanced stuff. The problem for postmodernists is that if you don't value rationality, you will not work hard to be rational. And in practice, what that means is that you're not going to be some super advanced, sophisticated post-rational thinker. Instead, what you're going to be is you're going to be one of these fucking deluded, anti-vax, conspiracy-minded right-wingers. That's in practice what you're going to get when you don't learn rationality. So you do have to be very careful here. When I make critiques of rationality, I'm doing it from a very advanced position. And you will notice that in my work, you will not find any conspiracy theories. You will not find any crazy anti-vax, pro-MAGA, pro-fascist, any of this kind of new age horseshit. You will not find that in any of my work. Why not? You would think that, I have such radical ideas. Why don't I subscribe to all that stuff? Because I have a deep foundation in rationality. I took years and decades of science, math, hard sciences, hard classes, studied that stuff deeply, which is what makes this work, the actualized work, so different from just New Age philosophy. Rationality requires years of training and high-quality education. Postmodernism lacks a grounding in the STEM fields: science, technology, engineering, medicine. These are hard fields. It's very tempting to skip over these fields and to jump into something like sociology, gender studies, psychology. Much more interesting, less dry. Engineering, dry as hell. Who wants to study that? What spiritual person wants to study that? They don't. But these spiritual people, they become so soft-brained. And these postmodernists too. And these social justice warriors, just fundamentally ungrounded. Grounding is key in this work. It's not just anything goes. Because as soon as you tell people reality is imaginary, love is everything, God exists, and life is a hallucination. As soon as you tell people these things, then it's like, it's just so convenient for the spiritual ego. You can just throw away all ground, all rationality, and just believe whatever bullshit you want to believe. That's not what I'm teaching. That would be a big, big trap. In practice, postmodernism fails to bring most humans up to meta-rationality and tier 2 stages of development. Instead, they get stuck at spiralidemic stage green, thereabouts, and then they fall into some sort of new age, weed-smoking subculture, groupthink ideology, just of a different kind. Postmodernism can have a problem with bypassing understanding of perspectives by smearing them as racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, white supremacist, fascist, capitalist, neoliberal, hate speech, right-wing stuff. So in practice, even though postmodernism is supposed to be like so understanding of marginalized perspectives, in practice, postmodernism really struggles to understand less developed perspectives, like the perspectives of right-wingers, hard right-wingers. But if you were doing postmodernism properly, you should gain a deeper appreciation and understanding of hard right-wingers and people who you disagree with racists and sexists and so forth. In practice, though, that doesn't happen. Because the work isn't really being done. What's happening is a bunch of virtue signaling rather than doing of the work. Postmodernism falls into excessive political correctness, suppressing lower spiral stages and perspectives, falls into demonization of modernism, capitalism, liberalism, rationality, and classic beauty. Postmodernism tends to have a preoccupation with identity politics, race, sex, minority status. This comes with its own problems. Really, we should be working towards a truly colorblind society. Now, I get it. This idea of a colorblind society has been misused and still is misused by a lot of right-wingers and conservatives. But that doesn't mean that the ideal is wrong. The ideal is correct. Postmodernism tends to falter in its preoccupation with oppressed minority groups. Some degree of that is necessary and important, but like everything, it can be taken too far. Postmodernism tends to be overly entitled, does not appreciate the brutality of life and the needs of social sacrifice. You can get so philosophical that you just get disconnected with ordinary survival. And when that happens, you start losing elections. Because politics fundamentally is about survival. Postmodernism can lead to softness and weakness and victim mentality, a lack of gratitude and appreciation for civilizations and its costs. Civilization has serious costs to have all of this technology, all of these social luxuries, healthcare and welfare and social safety net. There are costs to having these things. These things are not free. And postmodernists and these sort of progressive types, leftists, they don't appreciate this. Just how much these things cost. And I don't just mean in terms of money. I mean in terms of human sacrifice. A lot of these things like racism, sexism, patriarchy, hierarchies, oppression, exploitation from capitalism, empire, a lot of these are the costs of civilization, of development, of just your ability to do postmodernist philosophy. That's the cost of it. Those are the externalities that you're not seeing. The big problem with postmodernism is that postmodernism cannot build nor run civilizations. Civilization requires people doing tangible, grounded, brutal, ugly things. Racist things, sexist things, patriarchal things, domineering things. And postmodernism doesn't appreciate that. Postmodernism does not comprehend the importance and function of traditional cultures and structures. This is where you get all these sorts of far-left Marxist delusions about how society ought to be structured, which in practice can never work because it's disconnected from the actual realities of civilizational survival. There's a failure to appreciate the importance of conservative values, principles, lifestyles, and structures. For example, nationalism. To have a country, this is so basic that people don't understand. To have a country, you need to have a border and you need to have an army. And that army needs to be filled with men. Not with women, with men. Who are willing to sacrifice their lives for that border and that country. How do you get hundreds of thousands of men along on this project to go fight and kill other men in brutal combat, hand-to-hand combat, to defend your country? You're not going to do it with Marxism. For that to happen, you need nationalism. Your progressive postmodern philosophy is not powerful, potent enough to motivate somebody to go join the military. The opposite, in fact. You're going to go deconstruct the military, you're going to go deconstruct religion, you're going to go deconstruct national identity, you're going to deconstruct the border. As a postmodernist, you're going to deconstruct all these things. What are you going to be left with? You're going to be left with nobody to fight your wars. And then when you get invaded, raped and pillaged by your neighbors, then you'll understand why not everybody was a postmodernist and why nationalism and modernism and even pre-modernism were such important stages, which we still haven't grown out of. We are very far from growing out of those stages. Postmodernism tends to come with a loss of traditional and practical wisdom. You can see postmodernists getting kind of ridiculed sometimes where they are so philosophical, so intellectual, that they just lack basic common sense. It's like, you're so confused you don't even understand the difference between a man and a woman. Yeah, in a sense, that's ridiculous. It's absurd. To an ordinary person, it is absurd that you're not able to distinguish between a man and a woman. Now, of course, there's a higher level of understanding where it actually does become difficult to distinguish between a man and a woman. What is a man and a woman from a metaphysical point of view? That's legitimate. That's a legitimate question. That's important philosophy. But you see, for most people who are just living their life, who are raising a family, who have children that need to go to school and just go to sports and compete and win championships and just, succeed in the workplace and raise families of their own and have a successful dating life. For them, this idea of you're confused about what a man and a woman is, this is not only is this so entitled, so disconnected, in a sense, it's a disrespect for survival itself. It's a disrespect for life. That you can be sitting there worried about trans surgeries and this sorts of shit, when in practice, most people are barely struggling to feed their children and to have their children go to school and get decent grades and not commit suicide and not get, addicted to heroin. That's the reality of most parents' life. Not worrying about your fucking hormone blockers, this, and is he a man? Is that a man or a woman in a locker room, right? Like, you have to be sensitive to how this kind of philosophy disconnects you from where most people are at in life. That doesn't mean necessarily your philosophy is wrong in its, in its metaphysics and so forth. But it just means you're taking so much survival for granted. And when you do that, you better believe that's going to corrupt and screw up your philosophy too. because in the end, if you think that your life is run by your ideals and your philosophy, by your high Marxist ideals and philosophy and your social justice ideals, you're deluded. That's not what runs your life. What runs your life is survival, but you're taking that for granted. And the fact that your philosophy doesn't take that into account, that right there is the corruption. So with postmodernism tends to come this kind of like lack of common sense. Postmodernism easily forgets that social constructs are still very important and shouldn't be changed willy-nilly or too quickly. Just because something is a social construct doesn't mean it's not useful, doesn't mean it's not highly beneficial to the survival of mankind. Yes, categories do change over time, culture does change, morality does change, but remember, they change slowly and imperceptibly, and with violence. So there's a big difference between something changing over a period of 300 years through gradual social adjustment and consensus and generations of people dying out, and then changing something radically overnight through, pushing it through some sort of, political activism. There's a difference between these things. Changing social consensus is a huge deal. It requires buy-in from the entire community. So if you're some sort of advanced elite postmodernist in some university and you think you're going to go dictate to the rest of the world, the rest of the country in the flyover states, in the red areas, you're going to somehow convince them that, that a man can be a woman and a woman can be a man and so on, and that a man can get pregnant and that surgeries for their children are healthy and acceptable and are the compassionate thing to do. This just shows you how out of touch you are, how deluded you are. It's not per se that you're wrong, but you're just not reading the room. Most people are not into your postmodernist philosophy. Most people in the world are not even modernists. They're pre-modern. This idea that we live in a postmodern world is a fantasy. We don't really live in a postmodern world. When people say that, really, when people say, for example, that, we're living in the age of postmodernity, what that really means is that the top 1% of intellectuals are living in that. And that is referring to the cutting edge of human, intellectual development. Yes, in that sense, we're living in the age of postmodernity, but the majority of mankind is living still in pre-modernity, not even modernity. The majority of mankind has not even mastered rationality. They're in pre-rational. And here you are talking about trans surgeries and so forth. You see how disconnected you are? You're not reading the room. In 300 years' time, your trans surgeries will all be completely accepted by society, no problem. But that's going to take 300 years of growth, development, evolution, education, legal battles, violence, wars. That's how categories change. So just because you have personally identified something as a social construct, and now you think, it's just the border is just a social construct. Gender is just a social construct. Now we can just have open borders and we can just do whatever we want with our genders. No, you're fucking deluded. That doesn't follow. Yes, culture changes. Yes, culture in a sense is arbitrary. Yes, it's constructed, but it doesn't change as easily or as quickly as postmodernists and leftists assume. Postmodernists lack this understanding. Also, postmodernists fall on this point is postmodernism undermines people's values and worldview, which can be very harmful, dangerous, and unloving. Deconstructing culture leads to backlash. People don't like it when you deconstruct their culture and their social constructs. Okay, we're going to take a quick break here and I'll be back in a sec. Postmodernism is also wrong in that it leads to a loss of meaning, a sort of nihilism, a profound meaning crisis, in that it starts to deconstruct everything, to bulldoze all the constructions that society has made. And then what does it leave you with? What does it leave ordinary people with, based upon which they can build society? See, it's one thing to think about like intellectually deconstructing things in a philosophical way, but the reality is that the real world economy, when people go to church, when people are part of a culture and a community, go to school and maintain organizations and do all this sort of stuff, this has very little to do with the kind of academic philosophy and this kind of French intellectual tradition that postmodernism comes from. Postmodernism is wrong in that it doesn't improve the survival of most people. And that's fundamentally what society is about. It's survival. And that's, of course, why many people in society, especially those who are not in the intelligentsia, look upon postmodernism with great scorn and fear and frankly disgust, because it is in a certain sense disgusting. Because ordinary people are just struggling to pay the bills, to make sure their kids are not doing drugs, like this basic kind of stuff. And then these postmodernists come along and they deconstruct everything. What does that leave you with? Ordinary people are not intellectuals. They need simple narratives and categories. Quite frankly, most human beings do not even have the IQ enough to understand postmodernist philosophy. So where does that leave them? What works for cutting-edge intellectuals in a university academic setting does not scale across society, and many postmodernists are blind to this sort of thing. It's like they're out of touch. They're just out of touch with ordinary people. Society is run by business people, scientists, teachers, doctors, police, soldiers, firefighters, waitresses, cashiers. These are the people who make up society, not your postmodern Marxists, progressive intellectuals. Postmodernism fails to understand why the narratives that it's deconstructing were necessary and were constructed in the first place. These shared narratives and value structures are necessary to keep society together. For example, nationalism is necessary for people to have the kind of ideology they need to have to fight wars against invading countries and nations. To even have a thing as a nation, that's a construct. And yes, you can sit in a philosophy department and you can debate about, well, isn't a nation just a human construction? And after all, the borders between America and Mexico, those were just drawn by some guy on a map with a marker. So what does it really mean? The borders in the Middle East, they were just all drawn by some British guys sitting in some smoke-filled back room sipping tea and crumpets. And yes, there's a lot of truth to that on the one hand, but on the other hand, geopolitics is a very nasty, dirty business, and it's not based on any kind of truthfulness in a philosophical, existential sense. So yes, these lines were drawn, but then see, they weren't just drawn, then blood had to be paid by millions of people. Armies had to invade and defend against invading armies to uphold those boundaries. So it's much more than just a social construct. Of course it is, but appreciate the significance of these constructs. These constructs are so monstrously powerful and important that literally your nation exists thanks to this. And this idea that we can just live in a world without constructs and without borders, completely open borders, you see that this backfires, and this actually leads to counterproductive rises of fascism, authoritarianism, and nationalism, because that's necessary, because people are not postmodernist. In fact, most of the world is pre-modern. And many postmodernists just don't understand this because they're just so on the cutting edge of this intellectual fad. Society cannot function without meta-narratives. Postmodernism is also wrong in that some cultures are at higher stages of development than other cultures. That can be easily missed as you're trying to relativize everything. After all, isn't it the case that who's to say which culture is better? Is Middle Eastern culture better, Islamic culture? Or is Western American culture better? Or is Chinese communist culture? They're all the same, a postmodernist might say. And the reality, though, is that they're not the same. They function very differently. And in fact, on my blog, and if you haven't checked out my blog, you should follow it because I've been sharing a lot of important stuff there. On my blog, I share many examples of what I would call rather objective, fairly objective. We'll put objective in quotes. I'm always hesitant to use the word objective because I am so cognizant of these, relativistic factors and the constructions that go into some of this stuff. And since I'm coming at it from like a postmodernist perspective, you always want to be careful when you're saying anything is objective, especially on the human domain, in the political domain, that sort of stuff. But like I've shared many indices, the corruption index, the World Press Freedom Index, the Global Slavery Index. There's other ones that are escaping me. I've shared many of these on the blog. You can literally look at a map and you can see which cultures are more corrupt than other cultures. Now, a postmodernist might say, well, that's all relative. In a certain sense it is, but in a certain sense it's not. And we're going to discuss why that is in a bit here. Another way that postmodernism is wrong is that humans are far from equal. There are big differences in intelligence, in DNA, in personality type, in strength, in weakness, and in their stages of development. This is easily missed by postmodernists. And in general, developmental psychology is missed by postmodernists. They would take ideological objection to the idea that there can be a set of levels that a human being or a culture or a society develops up or down, because that supposedly means that one is better than the other. And postmodernism sort of wants to say that nothing is better than anything else because it's all just relative. There's truth in both of those perspectives. And if you only hold one or the other, you're going to fall into problems. Postmodernism, for example, goes overboard with this idea that men and women are physically and mentally the same, and that you can just turn a man into a woman or a woman into a man just by socially conditioning them or training them from a young age to be that way. That's actually not the case. That's not true. This idea that gender is infinitely fluid, this is very problematic. There is a certain sense in which gender is fluid, and gender is much more fluid than modernism assumed, but gender is not as fluid as postmodernism wants it to be. And that turns into a whole ideological can of worms. So that, and then of course this confuses children, this confuses people, and this upsets many parents. Many pre-modern and modern parents are very upset by this idea that gender and sex are infinitely fluid and that you can just identify as anything you want. But the reality is that you can't identify as anything you want, even though identity is a construct. But identity is more than just a social construct. There are more levels to construction than just social construction. This is one of the mistakes of postmodernism. But you can't just identify as anything you want. There is something meant when you identify as a man or a woman or white or black. There's something more to it than just a social construction. This can get lost on postmodernists. And biology is not just a social construction. There's more to human nature than just social constructions. Human nature actually, if you look at it very honestly, human nature is extremely limited. And you can only really appreciate that when you have transcendental experiences of the infinite, of the unlimited. When you understand what the unlimited is, what unlimited consciousness is, you see just how limited human nature is. But postmodernism tends to want to treat human nature as just a blank slate, and you could just socially condition whatever you want onto a human being. Now, human nature is extremely flexible, and you can brainwash human beings into believing all sorts of crazy things and acting in certain ways and so forth. But there's still very serious hard limits to that, which can be missed by postmodernists. And if you're a postmodernist and you believe that something like biology is just all social construction, human nature is just all social construction. Well, here's a little just simple counterexample to show you how wrong you are. What about human nutrition? Think about that. Is human nutrition just all relative? Really? You're going to take that position? It's just a story? It's just a social construction? Calories are just social constructions? Proteins and carbohydrates are just social constructions? So like, if I give you some rat poison to drink, that's just a social construction, right? Rat poison is just a social construction, right? Why do you care about reading nutrition labels when you're at the grocery store? Why do you care about how much sugar is in your food and so on? Hopefully you care about these things. Why? Well, it's obviously something deeper than just social construction. Some aspect of reality, some deeper aspect of reality is being tracked there. And it's important what kind of nutrition you have, what kind of toxins go into your system. That affects even your ability to do philosophy. See? So this idea that it's all just relative, it's like, well, Leo, companies invent these nutrition labels, and the government invents nutrition labels, and they can just reinvent them to be however they want. In a certain sense, yes, there's definitely wiggle room there. But in a certain sense, no. It's like there's limits to what they can construct. And if they go beyond those limits, then it turns into pure delusion and self-deception and nonsense. See? And it goes beyond that. It can be life and death at that point. Which is why when you read some new medicine that the doctor gave you, some antibiotics, you're reading the side effects. When you're reading those side effects, you're not reading that as a postmodernist. Like, oh, well, I'm reading these side effects include, stroke, heart attack, suicidal thoughts, depression, constipation, rectal bleeding. You're reading all this stuff. You're not reading that as like, well, this is just all up to interpretation. It's like they wrote it that way, and then I could reinterpret those in however I want. Maybe rectal bleeding doesn't really mean rectal bleeding. Maybe it means I'm going to have a great day. Maybe that's what it means. And then you'll quickly realize that that's not what it means. Right? So there is some common ground that we need in order just to have a functioning society, just even in order to have a functioning grocery store with a pharmacy. You can't just be all postmodernist about it. You need modernism. You need like a foundation, some sort of objective, and again, we're putting that in quotes, objective reality upon which that stuff is based. Also, where postmodernism goes wrong is with this notion that mental illness is just a social construction. Now, again, there's some truth to the idea that mental illnesses are constructs. For example, the classic example is that homosexuality was considered a mental illness, and then now it isn't. And now it's even offensive to suggest that. Seems kind of barbaric to even believe that. On the other hand, there are legitimate mental illnesses like serious schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, various kinds of narcissistic personality disorders, and so forth that are very serious. And it's not just a matter of like, well, if I have a mental illness, who's to say that that's worse than just a normal person? The reality is that for most people, it is worse. These people struggle to function. That we have mental hospitals full of millions of these people. They get very poor treatment. In many cases, they're poorly understood, and then they suffer a lot. A lot of homeless people are like this. That's the reality of mental illness, is that it's not just you're going to be some quirky, hippie, oddball, avant-garde intellectual with a mental illness. It's like, no. Realistically, what you're going to be is you're going to be a heroin addict who sleeps on the streets, begging for money just to get the next hit, mumbling to himself because you've got schizophrenia or whatever, and you can't get a job, you've lost your family, you've lost your friends, everybody, because you're just impossible to deal with. That's the reality of mental illness in most cases. Of course, there's exceptions where you can have somebody with a mental illness who's also some sort of savant genius, but those are much rarer. In the same way that it's much rarer to have a genetic mutation that is positive rather than negative. Usually they're negative. If you just do a random mutation, it's usually going to hurt you rather than help you. Postmodernism is wrong in that there are universal principles to living the good life. And in fact, this is what most people are missing. Religion tries to teach some of those principles, but religion is so corrupt and so ideological and so pre-modern that it's actually holding people back. But there are universal principles by which to live the good life. A human being cannot just live life any which way and get the same kind of results. But also, there are more ways to live than just one way, or one way that some religion says. There's more than one moral system. So it's not as simplistic. What I'm saying is here is not as simplistic as pre-modernism or modernism, but it's not as infinitely open as postmodernism would like to suggest. Another area where postmodernism is wrong is that it tends to devolve into this self-absorbed, self-indulgent, narcissistic, utopian sort of groupthink. A kind of intellectual egotism comes from it. Because the reality is that when you deconstruct the pre-modern and the modern, and you deconstruct all the social constructs and so forth, what are you left with? You're not left awakened. You're not left enlightened. There's a void that is created, but that void is not filled by genuine spiritual pursuit and realization, because postmodernists don't even understand that spirituality exists. They don't. Their philosophy doesn't even account for how spirituality could exist or what it could possibly mean. So when you're missing that real hardcore spiritual component to your life, what you end up with is just basically a sort of a faddish, intellectually self-absorbed egotism. Postmodernism goes wrong also in that it tends to be very pretentious, intellectually pretentious, disconnected from basic survival. It can be seen as decadent, frivolous, unmoored from common sense, utopian, and politically delusional. The bottom line is that postmodernism is just not very good, clear philosophy. It tends to devolve into mental masturbation and obscurantism. And here is a little example of what is meant by this intellectual masturbation and obscurantism. I'm going to read you a paragraph here from a postmodernist writer. This is such a convoluted paragraph, but it's a stereotype and a sort of an exemplar of what postmodernist writing is like. And it shows you really why this is not very good philosophy. Even if the ideas behind it were good, it's so convoluted. Just look at how this reads. I'm going to have difficulty just reading this to you, but here we go. Quote, "The move from a structuralist account in which capital is understood to structure social relations in relatively homologous ways to a view of hegemony in which power relations are subject to repetition, convergence, and rearticulation brought the question of temporality into the thinking of structure and marked a shift from an Althusserian theory that takes structural tonalities as theoretical objects to one in which the insights into the contingent possibility of structure inaugurate a renewed conception of hegemony as bound up with the contingent sites and strategies of the rearticulation of power." End quote. By Judith Butler. Judith Butler, preeminent postmodern feminist thinker. So the problem I have with this kind of philosophy is that it creates so much confusion. The mind is so lost in theoretical abstractions that it actually disconnects from the ground of reality, from consciousness. And it leads to bad philosophy, and it leads to bad ideas, but the bad ideas are not easy to notice because even reading through a postmodernist text, it's so challenging and convoluted that you're not going to be able to tell where it's going wrong. So either you're going to have to believe it, or you're just going to have to avoid reading it. And either way, that's not beneficial for people as a form of doing philosophy. As philosophy, postmodernism is wrong in that it fundamentally misses core existential truths. It misses consciousness. It misses states of consciousness. It misses psychological development. And it gets lost in these gross, obscure abstractions. which takes you away from what is necessary for ultimate awakening. Postmodernism also is wrong in that it doesn't offer a satisfying explanation of reality, because meta-narratives are now out. All you have are these micro-narratives. But when you have a bunch of micro-narratives, in a certain sense, there's a wisdom to that, because you can build these overarching, overly simplistic, stereotypical, very human-biased constructs and confuse those with real understanding of reality. That is a problem that exists at the pre-modern especially, and also at the modern. So postmodernism is correct to identify that. But then what are you left with? Then you don't have a profound understanding of reality, because all you have at that point, if you discount all those meta-narratives and things, then you're basically just left with what? With sort of like whatever the current intellectual fad is, the avant-garde, whatever is hip today, whatever hip ideas or philosophies are floating around, that sort of becomes your way of understanding reality. And it's all very fragmented and disconnected. And it seems like, well, Leo, that's just because reality doesn't really have a ground. It doesn't have a center. There's no easy explanation for reality. That's what a postmodernist would say. And I would say, yes, in a certain sense, that's very true. But there's a level beyond that you're missing, where there is a very profound, holistic, and satisfying understanding of reality, which is transhuman, trans-philosophical, trans-conceptual. It's beyond all that. And that's what you're missing, because you're so lost in this conceptual mental masturbation, for lack of a better term. And yes, there is a satisfying, very satisfying explanation of reality, but it's so profound that you're not going to get to it through postmodernism. You're going to have to transcend postmodernism to get there, which is why we're doing all this work here and explaining all these pitfalls. Another area where postmodernism tends to go wrong is that it tends to lead to things like being overly cynical, nihilistic, negative, destructive, and critical. Because if you're not doing something constructive intellectually, what are you doing? You're doing something destructive. And if you create a vacuum in the mind by removing all the meta-narratives through all this deconstruction, you leave a vacuum for the devil to come in and do his work. Don't forget how much easier deconstructing is relative to constructing. It's easy to criticize. You can criticize everyone in society for everything they do wrong. That's easy. The hard thing is coming up with better constructions. And that's what postmodernism tends to miss. And the constructions that it does come up with tend to be even worse than the constructions that were before, because they tend to be overly nihilistic, cynical, negative, pessimistic, unspiritual, for example, denying spirituality, denying consciousness, denying truth. These are not good constructs. And there's just fundamentally a lack of positive vision. People need a positive vision for how to build their life, how to live their life, why to pursue awakening in consciousness and improving society. If you take all that away from them, you might get something quite nasty as a result. You might get a sort of a disintegration of society that you didn't even anticipate, because you didn't appreciate how important the constructs were, and what it's like you're removing structural pillars from a house without understanding that they're structural pillars, because you're just like, you don't like how a pillar looks in your house, you want to knock it down because it's just aesthetically unpleasing, but you can't do that if it's holding the roof up. And this is what postmodernists tend to do. They like to knock things down just because it pleases them intellectually, without comprehending the significance of survival. And postmodernism is also wrong in that it tends to lead to ugly things like ugly culture, ugly art, ugly architecture, ugly literature, ugly poetry, ugly music, and even ugly people. Now that might seem like, well, Leo, you're being so judgmental. And after all, who's to say what's ugly culture, what's ugly art, what's ugly people? Again, it's one of those issues where it's like, yes, in a certain sense, it's all relative, but in another sense, there are standards of beauty. Everybody can tell the difference between an ugly person and a beautiful person, whether it's in how they dress or in how their facial features look, how they put on their makeup. There is such a thing as putting on too much makeup. Makes you ugly. Yeah, that can happen. And there are ugly cultures. Not all cultures are equally beautiful. Some are more beautiful than others. Now, of course, in practice, most cultures have plenty of ugly things in them and also beautiful things, so it's a mixed bag. But the idea that every culture is equally ugly and beautiful is also not true. And every philosophy is not equally beautiful. Some philosophies are quite ugly. Postmodernism goes wrong in that a lack of grand narrative results in a sort of an unholistic siloing of sense-making. Because then all you get are just these siloed micro-narratives and not a holistic understanding of what's really going on in society, in philosophy, in spirituality, in business and elsewhere, in science. Not only do you have to understand all those domains, which is already requires pretty large grand narratives, history as well, for example, but then you need to synthesize all those together like a thread, like a rope that has multiple ropes tied together to create an even stronger rope, to create this one large rope to make sense of what everything in the universe is going on. You can't really do that through this micro-narrative approach. It requires a profound holism, the importance of which can be lost on postmodernists. Postmodernism goes wrong in that postmodernism can be a clever distraction from teaching self-deception, survival, consciousness work, life purpose, awakening, spirituality, and rationality, and even STEM, the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, medicine. This is really what philosophy should be about, is about that stuff, not the intellectual masturbations of postmodernists. Postmodernism also misses the ego. You can't really have a serious philosophy of anything without understanding the ego, and that topic is largely absent from postmodernist understanding. And to whatever extent it's there, it's not a deep, profound understanding of ego, self, identity. Because if it was, it would lead to awakening, and it doesn't. There's no awakened postmodernists. A postmodernist doesn't understand what self is, fundamentally, which shows you the bankruptcy of the philosophy. Also, postmodernism is wrong in that nearly all postmodernism fails at self-reflexivity. Even though postmodernism is supposed to be a self-reflexive sort of next step above modernism, in practice, it's not self-reflexive enough to really awaken. Because if the self-reflexivity was really serious, it would lead to awakening, but it doesn't. And also what tends to happen with postmodernism is that it gets itself turned into a grand narrative. Even though postmodernism is supposed to, in its ideal, be a rejection of grand narratives, in practice what happens is that the human mind doesn't really know how to function without any kind of narratives or sense-making or overarching scheme. You can say you don't like it or that it's wrong or it's untruthful, but the reality is that when you throw it out, in practice, again, you're creating that void and some kind of narrative will sneak its way in there. So with most postmodernists, what ends up happening is that on some level, they reject grand narratives, but then on the other hand, they kind of sneak in. Postmodernism itself then becomes its own grand narrative, committing the very same sin that modernism and pre-modernism committed. And then postmodernism is now used to dominate and to act out certain biases against modernism and pre-modernism and even post-postmodernism, the transcendence of postmodernism. And this is, of course, the sneaky mechanics of the ego, which postmodernism doesn't understand. What postmodernists don't understand is that when you deconstruct the ego incompletely and you just deconstruct it on the surface in a conceptual, symbolic manner, the way that they do, what ends up happening is that you don't really deconstruct the ego. The ego just takes on some other intellectual framework like postmodernism. That becomes your new framework, and that is just not a really good framework for getting to the kinds of higher stages of development that a human being can get to. Which is why you have, for example, problems like in postmodernism where many postmodernists became or become Marxists and communists. even though Marxism and communism is a grand narrative, but they still subscribe to that, even though they're supposed to be against grand narratives. Why is that? Because in reality, postmodernism cannot even live up to its own ideals because the human mind just doesn't work this way, right? You need some kind of political philosophy. You can't just go around and have no political understanding or worldview or framework. You need some kind of framework. So in practice, most postmodernists are socialists. And then they don't see the problems with that. They don't see the contradictions there. If you were a true postmodernist, you couldn't be a communist. You couldn't be a Marxist. You couldn't be a socialist. Postmodernists are also not prepared for the corruption that runs society because they think that everybody's an intellectual like them, a philosopher, and they're not. Society is very, very corrupt, and you need a very practical philosophy to deal with that. You need a very practical politics. This is why Marxists fail. This is why socialists fail, because they don't understand how corruption works. And the reason postmodernists gravitate towards socialism or Marxism is because, well, if you're deconstructing everything and you're deconstructing all the sort of power hierarchies and you believe that the world is built on these power hierarchies of domination and you deconstruct all those, then you're supposed to be left with something very egalitarian, very flat, where everybody is like equally paid, has equal access to everything. It's like this pure egalitarian democracy, which ultimately is a stateless communism or something like that, or just socialism. You see, but it doesn't really work that way. That itself is a kind of philosophical delusion that postmodernism isn't really aware of. It's kind of like, that's what I meant by sneaking in the back door when you leave a vacuum. The problem for postmodernism is that everyone is selfish, biased, corrupt, and must act from some paradigm and must make sense of reality in some way. This is such a deep feature of the human psyche that your worldview, both your intellectual and your political worldview and framework, needs to really contend with that, which postmodernism often doesn't. So there's a conflation that happens between postmodernism, for example, and Marxism, which really shouldn't be happening, but in practice, it does happen. Then again, of course, you have many Marxists and socialists who are not really truly postmodern. So it can be difficult to figure out what's really going on in people's minds. Remember, there's really no such thing as a pure postmodernist. See, what's really happening is that the ego is taking on a philosophy. It could be Christianity, could be Islam, could be atheism, could be capitalism, could be Marxism, could be postmodernism. And it's not being intellectually integrous when it's doing that. It's using that for some sort of survival purposes. And so the postmodernist isn't realizing that postmodernism itself, even though it's claiming to be neutral and unbiased, but really it's not. It's a new kind of bias. It's a new kind of selfishness because the postmodernist has not transcended selfishness, hasn't even begun to understand survival and the self and the ego. This leads to a lot of problems, individually, also collectively. See, another big problem with postmodernism is that most human beings are nowhere developed enough cognitively, nor morally, nor spiritually, nor at the ego level, stages of ego development, to handle real postmodernism. So instead, what happens is that people tend to adopt postmodernism as an ideology. And it's very important to distinguish postmodernism as an ideology versus postmodernism as a stage of cognitive development. These are two very different things. So you can have somebody who's at a modernist stage of cognitive development, but takes on a postmodern philosophy because it's just hip. It's what's being taught in school. It can be used for social activism. And that's not the same thing as a deep comprehension of the limitations of modernist ways of looking at the world. Another area where postmodernism falls is postmodernism, of course, itself is a social construct. It's so ironic. But the whole popularity of postmodernism, it is like an intellectual fad. It's very groupthinky. But more importantly than that, which is what postmodernists don't recognize, is that postmodernism is deeper than just a social construct. It's a mental construct. It's constructed at an even deeper level that postmodernists don't even understand yet. It's an ego construct, and it serves the purposes of the ego. It doesn't serve truth. It serves ego. That's what's missed. That's the key. And then where postmodernism goes wrong is in its application of deconstruction. Remember that the ego, because the ego runs the show, the ego is going to use deconstruction as a weapon against all the things that it dislikes and is biased against, that doesn't serve its survival. And it's going to apply deconstruction unequally with double standards unfairly. So, for example, it will deconstruct capitalism and Christianity, but it won't deconstruct Marxism. And that is a perversion of deconstruction as a process. You have to be extremely careful with deconstruction because you can use deconstruction as a weapon to deconstruct all of your ideological enemies and not turn it in on yourself, on the ego. That's the real purpose of deconstruction. That's why deconstruction, as I teach it, is very different from postmodernist deconstruction. You notice that the deconstructions I talk about all the time are all centered on you, on yourself, not on your ideological enemies. That's a huge point of distinction. That's why the things that I teach are way beyond postmodernist understanding. If you're a postmodernist, how about you deconstruct wokeness? How about you deconstruct LGBTQ? How about you deconstruct human rights? How about you deconstruct socialism? How about you deconstruct trans, the whole trans phenomena? Deconstruct that. How about you deconstruct gender studies? How about you deconstruct leftism? How about you deconstruct university political activist culture, social justice movements? How about you deconstruct climate catastrophism? You see? You see the problem now? As soon as I say that now, if you're one of these progressive postmodernists, see, now you're not comfortable. Now you think I'm your enemy. Because, Leo, you're attacking all these supposedly progressive ideas, these egalitarian good ideas. What's wrong with all this stuff? Well, but if you're truly serious about deconstructing everything, then you should also deconstruct all this stuff too. Deconstruct all this leftist stuff. Because after all, it is all social constructions. All this stuff is social constructions. All of it is very faddish. All of it is very groupthinky. And then where does that leave you with then? What's going to be your political philosophy then? See, that's where it gets real. All right, now I want to give you a list of some absurdities of postmodernism. I went through and I found some like stereotypical examples of the kind of things that make more scientifically minded, rationally minded, modernist thinkers and pre-modernist even people not very happy and even ridiculing of postmodernism, because there are some truly absurd things that postmodernist philosophers and thinkers have said. So let's just go through a quick list of these. These are some of the most egregious examples. It's a bit of an unfair list because I'm picking out the worst of the worst here, but it gives you a little bit of a taste of how some of this, some of these wrongnesses of postmodernism, how it actually plays out in the real world, at least in the intellectual academic world. So first we have a postmodernist, Luce Irigaray, who asserted that E equals mc squared, Einstein's famous equation, is a, quote, sexed equation, end quote, because it, quote, it privileges the speed of light over other speeds that are vitally necessary to us, end quote. That's considered serious philosophy within postmodernist circles, supposedly. Rather ridiculous. She also said that fluid mechanics is unfairly neglected because it deals with, quote, feminine fluids in contrast to, quote, masculine solid mechanics. That's her explanation of why historically solid mechanics is better understood, is treated more in the textbooks than, for example, fluid mechanics, because the fluid mechanics are feminine and the solid mechanics are masculine. And of course, all the men, since they're running a patriarchy, the men only care about solid masculine mechanics, and they conceive of the universe in this mechanical way. Whereas if a woman was doing the science and there was no patriarchy, then supposedly maybe we would be talking more about feminine fluid mechanics instead. It's pretty ridiculous. Bruno Latour, famous postmodernist, famously made the case that the Gulf War didn't take place because it was mediated through television. His point being that what we consider the Gulf War is such a gross social construct that it only really exists through the television. Well, good luck telling that to the family of someone who lost a brother or a son in the Gulf War. Bruno Latour also famously made the case that there was a discovery made some decades ago where some researchers, some archaeologists were doing research on the tomb of the pharaoh Ramses in ancient Egypt. They did the archaeology on it, and they discovered, they analyzed his actual bones of the mummy, and they found that the bones contained tuberculosis, signs of tuberculosis. So they speculated that Ramses died from tuberculosis. And Bruno Latour wrote a philosophical paper saying that no, Ramses couldn't have died from tuberculosis because tuberculosis was only discovered a couple hundred years ago. And therefore, since it was socially constructed only 200 years ago, then Ramses couldn't have died from it. That's literally what he argued. Another example is Sandra Harding, who said that it would be as illuminating to call Newton's laws a, quote, Newton's rape manual, end quote, as it is to call it Newtonian mechanics. Newton's rape manual. Jacques Lacan said that the square root of -1 represents the phallus. What does that really mean? Who knows? Other quotes here from various postmodernist thinkers, some of them unnamed, is that the idea that logic and reason are tools of white male oppression. That's a statement that many postmodernists would agree with or have actually written. Or, for example, that objectivity is, quote, white supremacy culture. The idea that being objective and that truth itself, it's like, Leo, you talk about truth, but the only reason you talk about truth is because you're a white male participating within a patriarchy of a white supremacist culture. And that's wrong. That's not why I talk about truth. That's not what truth is. Now, of course, it is true that many people will bastardize truth because they have no understanding what truth is, and they will just call whatever they believe truth, and they will rationalize their own biases as truth. So it is true that many white supremacists call white supremacy culture as truth, and that's not true. That's false. But that doesn't mean that the notion of truth and objectivity itself is just white supremacy male culture. Or modernism. There's truth beyond the pre-modern, beyond the modern, beyond the postmodern. Here's a quote from a textbook written by postmodernists. Quote, objectivity as found through rational thought is a Western and masculine concept that we will challenge in this book, end quote. Here's another example from Catherine McKinnon, who said that she claimed that objectivity is a male perspective masquerading as truth. Postmodernist Roland Barthes said, quote, the author is dead, end quote, which means that the text in any author's work is just whatever the reader wants it to be. Anything. That means when you take out a box of rat poison, and on the box it says, warning, danger, extremely lethal, do not eat. You could interpret that as whatever you want because the author is dead. This rat poison box has no author. And meaning is all textual and relative to itself. It's just a collection of symbols that point to other symbols. Social construction. Rat poison is just a social construct. You see how absurd that gets. And last example here is from Foucault, Michel Foucault, who said that mental illness is primarily a social construct and that the modern prison system is no more humane than torture. Now, there is truth to that. There is some truth to that, but also don't forget the function of the prison system and mental asylums. People are put in these institutions, sometimes for wrong reasons, but a lot of times for good reasons. There are legitimate psychopaths. About 1/3, they've done research on this, about 1/3 of the prison system contains clinically identifiable psychopaths. You can actually do a brain scan, measure their brain, and you will know that they're a psychopath. And that's not just a social construction. You can do a brain scan on that. It's a relatively objective measure. And man, good luck to you if you think that, for example, being in a relationship with a psychopath is, hey, it's all relative. A psychopath, let's not discriminate against psychopaths. After all, we don't want to be unfair. We want to have empathy and compassion for psychopaths. So why don't I sleep with a psychopath? Why don't I get into business with a psychopath? Why don't I elect a psychopath as president? Why don't I get married to a psychopath? Well, if you think that way, you're putting yourself into some serious danger. So yes, these are some examples of the most extreme forms of postmodernist absurdities. They definitely exist, but be very careful here, because what pre-modernists and modernists who are closed-minded and stuck in their own frameworks and who have made an ideological boogeyman out of postmodernism, this sort of anti-woke movement, these anti-woke people, see, they will take these examples and now they will just regurgitate these examples like parrots to supposedly destroy and own postmodernism and to show how intellectually bankrupt it is. But be careful, because again, they have double standards too. They're weaponizing the stuff that I said here against postmodernism. This is also a bastardization and a corruption of these teachings. Because, of course, if you were objective and honest and you didn't have biases and double standards, you would see that absurdities, these kind of intellectual absurdities, they exist within pre-modernism and modernism as well. Each framework has its own contradictions and intellectual absurdities. That's not a mistake. That's one of the key things that I'm trying to teach you with all this work. So just because you can find some intellectual absurdities within Christianity or within pre-modern Islam, which are obvious to everybody who's a little bit more evolved, you can easily find those. But then if you take that overboard, for example, and now you throw the baby out with the bathwater, now you completely deny the idea of a God, now you're getting into self-deception. Likewise, you can point out absurdities and contradictions within science and rationality, which I've done in my series called Deconstructing the Myth of Science. And I will do another series called, well, I'm not sure what it's going to be called, but something like Deconstructing Rationality. You can deconstruct rationality and you can find absurdities within it, but you have to be very careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater and to think that now you've killed science, you've killed religion, you've killed rationality, because you haven't, because you still have to use these systems. You still have to have some kind of spirituality. And so be very careful about misusing the things that I teach you as a cudgel and a weapon against your ideological enemies. That's not That's not true to what is being taught to you here. You have to be very cognizant of your biases and your double standards. Let's conclude this episode with a quote which summarizes how many people feel about postmodernism, not necessarily myself, but just many people. Quote, "Everything in postmodernity looks foolish and doomed for failure, including its most glamorous aspects. It is not by chance that the heroes of postmodernity are freaks and monsters, transvestites and degenerates. This is the law of style." End quote. By Alexander Dugin. Now, we're still not done. There's going to be a part 3 to this series where we're going to unify a lot of stuff and sort of lead to a big picture conclusion. I want to, I've given you these lists of what's right and what's wrong about postmodernism and modernism, and now we're going to kind of tie it all together. So stay tuned for part 3. Now, you might wonder, well, Leo, you've given us these lists of what's right and what's wrong about modernism, postmodernism. But who are you to say? Isn't it just all your opinion, man, in the end? What is right, what is wrong about these worldviews? Of course, I'm presenting my perspective in a certain sense, and I'm very self-reflexively aware of that. So I might be introducing some of my own biases as I judge. Because look, in the end, once you finish learning a philosophy, you understand what it's really about, the gist of it. In the end, you have to come to some kind of conclusion for yourself about, is this true? Is this false? What parts of it are true? What parts of it are false? You can't avoid doing that. And usually, when you're talking about a very complex framework, mental framework, like postmodernism, or even modernism, or even pre-modernism, rarely is everything about it going to be false. There's going to be nuggets of truth that are important, but mixed in with a lot of corruption, egoic bias, and double standards, and obscurantist thinking, and just confusion, and kind of like murkiness. And so you get this thing, and so the real value in this work is separating out the wheat from the chaff. That's really what one of the functions of philosophy is to help you to do this intellectually with various frameworks, so that you can make sense of the world and not get lost in self-deception. So of course, just in doing that, I have to introduce my own judgments. I have to make judgments about what I think are the good parts and what are the bad parts. And that, of course, is influenced by my egoic needs, perhaps, my survival needs, any corruption within me, any biases that I have, of course. I try to, of course, be objective as I can, and it is important to be objective here, because if I was just coming at it from the perspective of what I personally believe or want to be true, then this wouldn't be useful. The reason this is useful is because it's grounded in something deeper, something truer. So my point to you is that if you're skeptical about some of the decisions that I've made about presenting what's right and what's wrong about these worldviews, remember, I'm not presenting this to you as a belief system or as an ideology. I'm giving you my conclusions, and really what you need to do now is you need to go through each point that I gave you and think through it deeply for yourself, independently, as though I didn't even talk to you about it. Contemplate through it, and then for every point decide, is this true or is this false? And go through this. This requires an inquiry process. It requires contemplation, which I've explained in the past on how to do effectively. So I'm presenting you with a sort of a blueprint of things that you can derive for yourself by doing hours and hours of deep and serious philosophical contemplation. That's the real work. And you're not going to get nearly as much value from my work and from watching this content if you don't do that work. That's your homework. So go do that. And if you do that, then you'll understand, your mind will start to grasp why the things that I'm saying to you are not merely my own personal opinions, even though at times they are. And maybe I sneak in a little bit of bias and corruption here and there. I do that. Throughout my work, you'll find that. But generally, you'll see that there's something deeper here that's being pointed to, something very valuable, something grounded. There's a ground It's not just all subjective. But you can't see that unless you do the investigative work. So that's your homework assignment. All right, I'm done here. This is a very long one. We still have some more to go. I just want to conclude by saying the following thing is that the best way for you to understand what postmodernism really is by looking at examples of actual postmodernist thinkers making arguments. I've posted some of this on my blog. And here, if you're not following my blog, I post so much profound, amazing stuff on my blog. I put a lot of time into it. Hundreds of hours go into making my blog. I post a lot of epistemic examples, both examples in the good and examples in the bad, which help you to draw distinctions between the quality of these different kinds of frameworks and views. So go through my blog, search through examples that I've posted of postmodernist thinkers, and look at how they argue. And then think about where are their arguments sound and where are they unsound. Try to disprove their arguments with counterexamples. And I will post more of that on my blog going forward as well. So if you haven't visited my blog, be sure you do. It's free. All the stuff on there is free. You'll find very juicy, life-changing insights, examples, videos. I share a lot of fascinating and just practical stuff on there.